A man who buried his identity in a small-town garage. A woman who buried hers under a stolen name. One crash on a rain-slicked highway. One choice that neither of them would ever be able to take back. She was running from people who had already decided she wouldn't survive. He was just trying to get through another Tuesday without falling apart. But some nights, the world doesn't care about your plans. If you've ever believed that doing the right thing could cost you everything, stay with me until the end. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain started around 9 and didn't apologize for it. By 10:15, Route 7 outside of Millhaven, Kentucky, was the kind of wet that turned headlights into smears and made the white line down the center of the road disappear into gray nothing. The ditches on both sides ran fast and brown, and somewhere in the dark, a branch had come down across the shoulder near mile marker 42, though nobody had called it in yet. The county didn't rush for branches in October, not when there were bigger problems. Ethan Knox was not on Route 7 that night because he wanted to be. He was there because Emma had a fever and he'd driven 40 minutes to the only pharmacy still open at that hour, the CVS over in Danford, and now he was driving back with children's ibuprofen and a box of tissues and a small stuffed rabbit he'd bought on impulse near the register. Not because Emma had asked for one, but because she was 7 and sick, and he was her father, and sometimes that was enough reason. The truck was a 2009 Ford F-150 that he'd rebuilt himself piece by piece over the course of 18 months in the bay behind the shop. It didn't look like much. The paint had oxidized along the hood, and the passenger side mirror had a crack running through the glass that he kept meaning to fix. But the engine was clean and the brakes were solid, and Ethan Knox had learned a long time ago that what a thing looked like on the outside had very little to do with what it was capable of doing under pressure. He had the radio off. He preferred silence when he drove at night, especially in rain. Silence let him hear things. It was a habit he couldn't seem to quit, the same way he couldn't quit sitting with his back to walls in restaurants or cataloging exits every time he walked into a room. His therapist, he'd seen her exactly 4 times before deciding he was fine, had called it hypervigilance. Ethan called it paying attention. He saw the headlights before he heard anything. They were coming fast on the westbound lane, maybe 300 yards ahead, and even at that distance, something about the way they moved felt wrong, too lateral, drifting right in a way that had nothing to do with the curve of the road. He lifted his foot off the gas automatically, just watching, the way you'd watch something falling before you understood what it was. Then the headlights swung hard, a correction that came too late, and the car hit the guardrail at the edge of the highway bridge. The sound of it reached him half a second later. Not a crunch. More like a tearing, metallic, and sustained, the kind of sound that a guardrail makes when something with real weight and real momentum hits it without slowing down. Then the headlights tilted. 45 degrees, then 70. Then they were gone, past the rail, past the edge, dropping into the darkness below the bridge where Millhaven Creek ran full and cold in October. Ethan had already pulled the truck to the shoulder before the splash. He didn't think about it the way people think about decisions. There was no internal debate, no weighing of options, no moment where he asked himself whether this was a good idea. His body simply moved because his body had been trained for 8 years to move in exactly this kind of situation, and the training didn't care that he'd been out of the Navy for 2 years and was driving home with cough syrup and a stuffed rabbit. He was out of the truck with the door left open, running toward the bridge. He grabbed the emergency kit from behind the seat without breaking stride, flashlight, trauma kit, 2 road flares, and hit the rail where the guardrail had buckled. Below, in the creek, he could see the pale shape of a car. A large one. Pale gray or silver, hard to tell in this light. It had come down on its wheels, which was something, but the front end was already underwater and the current was pushing at the driver's side with enough force to make the whole thing shudder. He registered the car's make before he registered much else. Bentley Continental, current generation, which told him 3 things in rapid sequence. The driver had money, the car was heavy, and the windows were power-operated, which meant if the electronics shorted in water, he was going to need to break glass. The creek bank was steep and wet, and he went down it the way you go down things in the rain when you don't have time to be careful. Fast, weight back, using his left hand on the slope to keep from rolling. He hit the water and felt it immediately, mid-thigh cold, moving faster than it looked from above. October creek water in Kentucky. It didn't invite you in. He waded to the driver's side. The window was partially open, maybe 2 inches, which meant the electronics were still live, or had been when the car hit the water. He pressed the flashlight against the glass and looked in. She was in the driver's seat, unconscious, head tilted against the window post, a cut above her left eyebrow bleeding the way head wounds do, extravagantly, dramatically, in a way that looked worse than it usually was, but sometimes wasn't. Late 20s, maybe 30, dark hair plastered to her face by the water coming in under the door seal. She was wearing a gray blazer, business clothes, seatbelt still on. Ethan tried the door. It didn't open. The impact had warped the frame. "Hey!" He knocked on the glass. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. The water inside the car was at her ankles now. The front end was going down faster than he'd thought. He had maybe 4 minutes before the water line reached the window, 2 minutes after that before the situation became something he couldn't recover from. He went around to the passenger side. That door opened. Not easily, and he felt something wrong in his left shoulder as he yanked it. An old injury, a rotator cuff thing from a deployment that had never healed correctly. But it opened, and he leaned across the center console and put 2 fingers on her neck. Pulse. Strong and even. "Good. Ma'am, I need you to wake up." He pressed his knuckles against her sternum. Sternal rub. Not gentle, not supposed to be. She made a sound, low and pained, the involuntary sound a person makes when their body registers pain before their mind catches up. "That's good," Ethan said. "Stay with me. I'm going to get you out." He reached across and got the seatbelt release. He had to push her weight sideways to get to it. She wasn't small, and unconscious people are uncooperative in a very specific way that living people don't quite understand until they've tried to move one. He got the belt free and positioned himself to drag her across the console. "This is going to hurt," he said, mostly to himself. He got her out through the passenger side and got her up the bank in 2 trips. First her, which required everything he had and a few things he probably didn't anymore, and then his kit, which was an afterthought. He laid her on the flat grass above the waterline and knelt beside her and started running through the assessment the way he'd been taught. Airway clear, breathing regular. The head wound was still bleeding freely. Pupils, he checked with the flashlight, equal and reactive. Good sign. There were no other obvious injuries he could find through her clothing. Possible rib bruising from the seatbelt, possible concussion, definite shock. None of it was immediately life-threatening as long as she stayed conscious and warm and didn't start showing signs of internal bleeding, which he couldn't rule out but couldn't confirm without equipment he didn't have. He stripped off his jacket and laid it over her. Then she opened her eyes. They were dark brown, the kind of brown that looks almost black in low light. And for a moment they were entirely unfocused, just pointed upward at the rain and the dark, registering nothing. Then something came into them. Awareness, fear. The specific sudden fear of a person who wakes up in an unknown place with an unknown person leaning over them. She tried to sit up. "Easy." He put a hand on her shoulder. "You're out of the car. You're on the bank. You're okay. The car, don't worry about the car. I need my..." She tried again, and this time he let her sit up partway, watching her face for signs of vertigo. Her hand went to her head, found the blood, came away dark. "Head wounds bleed a lot," he said. "It looks worse than it is, probably. Might need stitches." She looked at him. Really looked at him, maybe for the first time. He was kneeling in creek water in a flannel shirt, his jacket now covering her, his flashlight in one hand and his trauma kit open on the grass beside him. He was soaking wet from the waist down. The rain was still coming. "Who are you?" she said. "Nobody," Ethan said. "I was just driving past." She stared at him. "You just drove past and pulled me out of a creek?" Roughly. She seemed to process that. There was a tremor in her jaw that she was trying to control and doing a decent job of it, actually, though not quite decent enough. "I need to make a call," she said. "I can call an ambulance?" "No." The word came out harder than she probably intended. She caught herself. "No ambulance. I have someone I need to call." Ethan sat back on his heels and looked at her. She was pale under the blood and the rain, and there was something in the way she'd said no ambulance that was worth noticing. Not embarrassment. People said no ambulance for money reasons, and he understood that. But something tighter than that. Something that paid attention to the word ambulance specifically. to what an ambulance brought with it. Official presence, names on reports. He handed her his phone. She looked at it, then looked at him. Could you? He stood up and walked 10 feet down the bank and looked at the creek. The Bentley was mostly submerged now. The rear end was still visible, tilting slowly, the taillights blinking once before going dark. Expensive car. Someone was going to have feelings about that. He could hear her talking behind him, low and urgent, but he couldn't make out the words. He didn't try to. He pulled one of the road flares from his kit and cracked it, and set it at the top of the bank near the road edge, where approaching traffic could see it. It wasn't much, but it was something. When he turned back, she'd finished the call and was sitting up fully, his jacket still around her shoulders, her knees pulled to her chest. The cut above her eyebrow had slowed to an ooze. She was watching him. "Are you actually a paramedic?" she said. "No." "Military?" He picked up the kit and started closing it. "Does it matter?" "You did a pupil check," she said. "You knew to keep me from moving. You've done this before." "My daughter gets hurt a lot," Ethan said. "Kids do." She was quiet for a moment, then, "You have a daughter." It wasn't a question exactly, more like she was filing the information away. He noticed that. "Someone's coming to get you?" he said. "Yes, 20 minutes. I'll wait on the road until they get here." "You don't have to." "I know," he said. He climbed back up the bank to the road and sat on the tailgate of his truck and listened to the rain. Below, the creek moved. The flare hissed and bled red light across the wet pavement. He could see the top of her head from where he sat, her dark hair lit in flashes when a car passed. Not many, at this hour. And she sat very still on the bank with his jacket around her shoulders and didn't try to climb up on her own. He appreciated that. It was hard to stay still when everything in you wanted to move. He knew something about that. 18 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up. 2 men got out, quick and professional, moving to the guardrail and over the edge without hesitating. Private security, Ethan guessed. The way they moved, the way they scanned the road before they descended. Nobody who worked for a government agency moved quite like that. Government people had too many procedures. These were men employed directly by someone who could afford people like that. He watched them help her up the bank. She was moving under her own power now, which was a good sign, though she accepted the support of the taller man's arm without argument. At the top, she stopped. She looked at Ethan across the 12 feet of wet pavement between them. Rain was still falling, lighter now, the worst of the storm having passed to the east. He was still sitting on his tailgate. The rabbit and the ibuprofen were behind him on the seat. "I don't know your name," she said. "You don't need it," Ethan said. She held his jacket out toward him. He shook his head. "Keep it. You're cold." Her expression shifted, not dramatically, not into something you could easily name. It was the look of someone who was used to having things very clear and organized and who had just encountered something she couldn't categorize. She got into the SUV. The 2 men followed. The doors closed. Ethan watched the taillights until they disappeared around the curve, then sat there another minute in the quiet and the diminishing rain. Then he picked up the bag with Emma's ibuprofen and the rabbit and got back in the truck and drove home. Emma was asleep when he got back, curled on her side with her blanket pulled up over her ear, the way she'd slept since she was a baby. His wife had used to say she slept like a pill bug, tucked into herself. He sat on the edge of her bed for a minute and put his palm lightly against her forehead. Still warm. Not dangerously warm. He set the ibuprofen on the nightstand and left the rabbit next to her pillow, where she'd find it in the morning. He showered and changed and made himself a cup of coffee he didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table for a while, listening to the rain slow and eventually stop. He was not thinking about the woman in the creek. He was mostly not thinking about her. He went to bed at midnight and lay there with his eyes open for an hour before he finally slept. Quote, in Millhaven, Ethan Knox was not a remarkable person. That was something he'd worked at. He'd come back from the Navy 2 years ago, back to the small town where he'd grown up, back to the shop where his uncle had taught him to pull an engine before he was old enough to drive one. His uncle had retired to Florida 3 years prior and left Ethan the shop in a handwritten note that he'd found in a drawer when he was cleaning the house after his wife's funeral. Knox Auto, 14 Birch Street. The building's paid for. The tools are yours. You're going to need somewhere to be. His uncle had always understood things without being told them. He'd been in the Navy since he was 22, had completed SEAL training at 24, and had spent the next 8 years doing things that he couldn't talk about in detail and didn't particularly want to. Not because they were shameful, most of it wasn't, but because talking about them made the things more real in a way that living quietly in Millhaven, Kentucky, specifically tried to prevent. He'd been good at the work. He knew that. His commanding officer had told him he was one of the best combat medics they'd had in the unit in a decade, which was saying something because SEALs were not a group inclined toward compliments. He'd met Caroline at a 4th of July party in 2017, at a barbecue in Virginia Beach that he'd only attended because a teammate had refused to take no for an answer. She'd been a school teacher then, 2nd grade, and she'd been standing near the cooler with the lukewarm beer arguing with someone about a book he'd never heard of, and she had a laugh that was too loud for polite company and didn't care at all about it. Emma was born in 2018. Caroline was diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia in 2020 during his 7th deployment. He'd gotten emergency leave and come home and watched the woman who had the too loud laugh lose the laugh first, and then, slowly, the other things. She died in a hospital bed in March of 2021 at 2 in the afternoon with Emma asleep in a chair by the window and Ethan holding her hand. Emma had been 2 years old and would not remember her mother's face directly, which was a fact that lived in Ethan's chest like a stone he'd learned to carry. He'd put in his separation paperwork 2 weeks later. In Millhaven, he was the mechanic on Birch Street. He was Emma's father. He was the guy who always had a jumper cable and who didn't say much at the diner but tipped well and remembered everyone's names. He coached Emma's soccer team in the fall. Badly, he would freely admit, because he knew absolutely nothing about soccer and had had to watch 17 YouTube videos to understand the offside rule. And he drove her to school every morning and picked her up every afternoon and made dinner 4 nights out of 7 and accepted the existence of frozen pizza without shame on the remaining 3. He was not a hero. He'd been a soldier, which was a different thing entirely, and he'd left the soldier behind because Emma needed a father more than the Navy needed another operator. That was the story, and he kept it simple. He didn't think about the woman again until Thursday, when the story appeared in the local news. He was eating lunch at the counter of his shop, a sandwich he'd made that morning, turkey on wheat, unremarkable, when he saw it on his phone. A brief item, mostly a traffic notice. A single vehicle accident had occurred on Route 7 near mile marker 42 late Monday night. A luxury vehicle had gone through a guardrail. No fatalities reported. Driver transported by private vehicle, condition not disclosed. Authorities were investigating whether weather conditions contributed to the accident. Driver transported by private vehicle. He set down the sandwich. There was no mention of a rescue. No mention of anyone pulling a person from the water. Just private vehicle, which was accurate and vague, and was, he suspected, exactly what she wanted it to be. He didn't know how he felt about that, and he didn't spend much time trying to figure it out. Well, she found him 9 days later. He knew it was her before he looked up from the engine bay. He heard the car first, something expensive, idling well, pulling into the lot with the careful precision of a driver who wasn't used to gravel. And then he heard the door, and then the footsteps. And something in the cadence of them was familiar in a way that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up before his brain caught up with the information. He straightened and turned. She was standing at the edge of the bay, out of the shadow, in a different blazer, navy this time, with her dark hair pulled back and a silk scarf knotted at her throat. Professional, composed. The cut above her eyebrow had been closed with butterfly strips and was already healing well. She was carrying no bag, which told him the visit was deliberate and minimally accompanied. She looked at him for a moment. "The coat," she said. "It's a Carhartt Detroit jacket, size large, well-worn, with a tear at the left elbow that's been repaired with electrical tape. I had someone check every auto repair shop within 45 miles. Ethan looked at her. "That must have taken a while," he said. 6 days. She took a step forward. "I'm Victoria Hayes." He already knew that. He'd looked her up after seeing the news item, the same way he'd tell himself he wouldn't. Victoria Hayes, CEO of Vantage Medical Technologies, based in Nashville. 32 years old. The company was mid-sized and growing, specialized in cardiac and pediatric medical devices. Their most recent funding round had put them in the tech business press. She'd given an interview once where someone had called her ruthlessly competent, which she'd apparently found funny enough to quote in her own company bio. "Ethan Knox," he said. "You saved my life. You were breathing when I got there. The car was going underwater." "Sure." She looked at him with the expression of someone who had prepared multiple conversational angles and was finding that none of them were landing. I want to thank you properly. I have a foundation. We do grants for—" "That's not necessary." "Mr. Knox, I was driving by," he said. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," she said, and the flatness of her tone stopped him. "They wouldn't have. I've thought about this a lot this past week. What you did, the way you did it, that was not someone who happened to be driving past. You had a trauma kit. You knew exactly what to assess and in what order. You got me out of that car in fast-moving water at night in the rain, and you did it without panicking and without making me panic." She paused. "Who does that?" Ethan went back to the engine. "Someone with a first aid course." "Military," she said. It wasn't a guess. He kept his eyes on the carburetor. "Navy," she said. "I looked you up too, Mr. Knox. Not much comes up, but enough. Navy, 8 years, and then nothing, which usually means something specific." He put down the wrench, turned and looked at her across the hood. "You drove 45 miles to say thank you. You've said it. I appreciate it." "I want to buy you a meal," she said. "One meal. Not a grant, not a check, not a press release. Just a meal. You can bring your daughter if you want." He opened his mouth. "I know about Emma," she said. "I know she's 7. I know she goes to Millhaven Elementary. I know you coach her soccer team. I'm not—" She stopped, seeming to hear how that sounded. "I'm not a stalker. I'm a CEO. I have a researcher. I'm sorry, that was overreach." He almost smiled at that. Almost. Yeah, it was. She had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, which he hadn't expected from someone who'd opened with, "I had someone check every auto repair shop within 45 miles. One meal," she said. "No agenda." He looked at her for a long moment. She was direct in the way certain people are direct. Not aggressively, not performatively, but in the way of someone who learned early that ambiguity costs too much time and too much energy and simply stopped tolerating it. "There's a diner on Mill Street," he said finally. "Friday, noon. Don't bring your researcher." She was there before him. That surprised him slightly, though it probably shouldn't have. She was the type of person who arrived first and used the time to think. She was in a booth near the window when he came in, no blazer this time, just a plain white shirt and jeans and her hair down, and she was reading something on her phone that she put away when she saw him. The Millhaven Diner was not a place that catered to people like Victoria Hayes. It had a pie case near the register that only ever had 3 kinds of pie, and one of the 3 was always coconut cream, whether you wanted it to be or not. The coffee came in a mug that had lived long past its aesthetic prime. The menu was laminated and smelled faintly of the cleaning solution they used on the tables, which was strong enough that it had its own presence in the room. She had already ordered coffee and was working on it when he slid into the booth across from her. "You look different without the rain," she said. "You look better without the head wound." She touched the healing cut reflexively. "Still pretty visible." "Fading," he said. They ordered, but she got a club sandwich and ate most of it, which he noted. He'd half expected her to move things around on the plate and call it lunch. He got the pot roast because it was Friday, and the pot roast was the reason to come here on Fridays, and he ate it without apology. They talked. Not easily at first. Carefully, the way you talk to someone whose full dimensions you don't know yet and aren't sure you want to. She asked about Emma, and he answered briefly but without the flatness he usually deployed when strangers asked personal questions. She asked how long he'd been in the Navy, and he said 8 years, and she said, was it by choice? Leaving. And he said it was. She didn't ask what it was like. He noticed that. Most people asked what it was like, and what they meant was, tell me something dramatic. Tell me about the danger. Give me something I can picture. She didn't ask any of that. She moved past the military chapter entirely, as if she'd already decided that it wasn't hers to ask about. Instead, she asked, how do you like being a mechanic? He looked at her. Genuinely asking, she said. I like it, he said. And then, because she seemed to actually mean it, it's clear. Something's wrong, you find it, you fix it, you know it's fixed. There's a satisfying amount of certainty. She nodded slowly, like that made more sense than he'd intended it to. My work is the opposite of that, she said. Everything is ambiguous for years, and then it isn't, and then it's ambiguous again. Medical devices. Cardiac devices, mostly. We're working on a pediatric application right now that... She stopped. Something crossed her face that was there for a moment and then wasn't. That's been a long road. Good work, though, he said. It will be, she said, when it gets where it needs to go. He thought about asking what that meant. He didn't. What he noticed instead was this. She ate her lunch and held her coffee cup with both hands and talked like someone who was used to being watched in public and had carefully learned how to take up exactly the right amount of space. But twice during the conversation, something happened. Once when she mentioned the pediatric project, and once when a truck backfired in the parking lot, where the careful management slipped just slightly, where something underneath came up for air. The truck backfiring was the more telling of the two. Her eyes moved to the window before her expression did. It was a fast, automatic scan, quick assessment of the lot, quick check of the sightlines. And then she settled back and picked up her coffee, and the whole thing took maybe 2 seconds, and she probably didn't know she'd done it. But Ethan knew what that kind of reflex looked like, because he had the same one. He didn't say anything about it. It wasn't the kind of thing you said anything about. After lunch, he walked her to her car, a rental this time, a navy Volvo that matched the now absent Blazer, which made him think she had a color preference, and stood on the sidewalk while she unlocked it. Thank you, she said. For lunch. And for the other thing. The other thing, he repeated. For not letting me drown. You weren't drowning. Yet, she said. He watched her get in and pull out into Mill Street and drive north toward the highway. He stood on the sidewalk a minute after she'd gone, hands in the pockets of his jacket, not the Carhartt, which he still hadn't gotten back, but an old canvas barn jacket that lived in the truck. Something about the way she'd scanned the parking lot. He walked back to the shop. The following Tuesday, Emma knocked over her orange juice at breakfast and dissolved into tears that were slightly disproportionate to the event, and Ethan recognized the specific despair of a child who was crying about something other than orange juice and sat down on the kitchen floor next to the puddle and held her for a while without asking what was wrong. She smelled like her shampoo, which was strawberry-scented, and which he had not chosen, but which Emma had selected from the bottom shelf of the drugstore with the full authority of someone who had given the matter careful thought. Is it the juice? He said. No. Soccer practice tomorrow. She shook her head. Something at school. She didn't answer for a minute. Then, Kylie said I didn't have a mom. Ethan was quiet. I said I did have a mom. She just died. Emma continued in the tone of a child presenting a legal argument. But Kylie said that's not the same as having one. Kylie's not wrong, Ethan said carefully. It's not the same, but it doesn't mean you don't have one. Emma seemed to consider that. Can you still have something if it's gone? Yeah, he said. Yeah, you can. She thought about this for a while, which was what she did with things she wasn't sure about. She held them and turned them and didn't rush to a conclusion. She'd been doing that since she could talk. Finally, she straightened up and wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, Okay. He cleaned up the orange juice. She had another glass. They were 10 minutes late to school. In the truck, stopped at the one actual red light in Millhaven, she said, Dad? Yeah. Did you always want to be a mechanic? He glanced over at her. No. What did you want to be? I wanted to be someone who helped people, he said. I thought that meant being a soldier. But it turns out there are a lot of ways to help people. She looked out the window at the passing town. Like fixing their cars. Like that, he said. Or pulling them out of creeks, she said. He looked at her. She shrugged, small and unconcerned. Mrs. Harwick told Mr. Harwick and Mr. Harwick came into the shop and I heard him telling Kyle. You heard that. You should fix the vent in the office, she said. You can hear everything through it. He put the truck back in gear when the light changed. That was private, he said. I know, Emma said. Don't worry. I didn't tell Kylie. That Wednesday night, at 8:47 p.m., his phone rang with an unknown number. He almost didn't answer it. He was doing the dishes and Emma was in bed, and unknown numbers at that hour were almost always automated voices with urgent news about his car's extended warranty. He answered it. Mr. Knox. Her voice was low and something was wrong in it. Not quite fear, but the precursor to it. The state of alertness right before fear sets in, when the body has decided but the mind is still catching up. Ms. Hayes. A pause. Short, but long enough to notice. I may have understated some things, she said, the other day, about my situation. He turned off the water, leaned against the counter. Okay. I want you to know I'm not... She stopped again. He could hear road noise in the background. She was in a car, moving. I'm not trying to involve you in anything. That's not why I'm calling. You gave me your number at the diner in case I needed the coat back, and Are you safe right now? He said. A beat. I think so. He looked at the ceiling. Where are you? He said. She told him. He was already moving to get his keys. She was parked in the lot of a closed hardware store on Clement Road, about 6 miles east of Millhaven, when Ethan pulled in beside her. The Volvo's engine was running and all 4 doors were locked. He could tell by the way the interior light didn't come on when he approached. She unlocked it only after he knocked on the window and she'd had a second to look at his face. He got in the passenger side. She looked like she'd been sitting in the dark for a while. The kind of sitting that happens when you've run out of things to do with your hands. Her phone was in her lap, screen down, and she was wearing the same white shirt from Friday's lunch, but with a jacket thrown over it that wasn't quite warm enough for the night. Her hair was loose and slightly disheveled in the specific way of someone who'd been running their hands through it. There was a man, she said, outside my hotel. He was there when I checked in, and when I came down for dinner, and when I came back up. Different spots each time, different posture, but the same man. Same shoes, Ethan said. She looked at him. That's usually how you catch it, he said. People change jackets, change their stance. They forget about the shoes. Brown work boots, she said. Yes, he nodded slowly. You're sure it was the same man each time? I have a good memory for faces. She said it without pride, just as a fact. I know what I saw. Ethan looked out through the windshield at the empty lot, at the closed hardware store with its darkened windows, at the highway beyond. The night was clear after last week's rain, cold and still, with a half moon hanging low. Any idea who'd want to have eyes on you? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, My company is in the middle of some complicated internal politics. There are people who'd benefit from knowing my movements. She delivered this carefully, the way someone delivers a partial truth, accurate as far as it goes, but deliberately stopped before it reaches the part that would really answer the question. He let it sit. You called me, he said. Not your security team. My security team answers to my board of directors. She picked up her phone and put it down again. Right now, that's not the same as answering to me. Ethan thought about that. A CEO whose own security team might be compromised, or at minimum divided in its loyalties. That was not a small problem. That was a problem that had structural roots and probably hadn't appeared overnight. Okay, he said. Okay, what? Okay. I'll drive back to your hotel with you, check the lot, check the perimeter. If the man is still there, we'll figure out what to do next. If he's not, you go inside and you set the secondary lock, and you call me if anything changes. She stared at him. You don't know me. Not well. This isn't your problem. No, he said. It isn't. She kept looking at him with the expression of someone trying to locate the angle, the calculation behind the offer. He understood that. People in her position, people who had arrived where she'd arrived by a combination of intelligence and relentless work, and the particular kind of vigilance that comes from knowing nobody's going to hand you anything, those people didn't receive help without looking for what it cost. There's no angle, he said. You're alone in a parking lot because you didn't feel safe going back to your room. That's the whole thing. She looked down at her phone. Then she said quietly, I don't usually do this. Call mechanics? Ask for help. He didn't say anything to that. It didn't need a response. They drove back to the Comfort Inn on Route 7 in their separate cars, Ethan running the lot first with his headlights off, moving slowly through the rows. He didn't see brown work boots. He didn't see anyone sitting in a parked car, who didn't have a reason to be sitting in a parked car. He did see a couple arguing near the ice machine and a teenager walking a dog with absolutely no urgency, which was the most normal thing he'd seen all week. He texted her, "Clear." She pulled in. He watched her get to the entrance. She turned at the door and found him still parked. Raised one hand. He drove home. Emma was still asleep when he checked. The rabbit he'd bought her was on the floor where it always ended up by morning, and he put it back on the pillow and stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to her breathe, which was something he did more than he'd ever admit to another adult. He went to bed. He slept better than he expected. She called Thursday morning before he'd opened the shop. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "You don't," he said. "I know I don't. I want to anyway." A pause. "Are you busy this afternoon?" He had a brake job at 2 and an oil change at 3:30 and a transmission flush he'd been putting off because the customer kept rescheduling. "I can do after 5, he said. "There's a park on Millhaven Creek," she said. "The one with the walking trail. I saw it when I drove through town. The Creekside Memorial Park." "Is 5:30 okay?" "I'll have Emma with me," he said. "She has soccer practice until 5. I pick her up after." Another pause, shorter this time. "That's fine, Bob." He was not sure. Driving to the park with Emma arguing in the back seat about whether the music he was playing was boring to his side. It was a Tom Petty album, and yes, apparently it was boring. Say what exactly he was doing. He was sure about a few things. He'd been trained to recognize when someone was in genuine danger and when they were manufacturing it, and Victoria Hayes was doing neither. Whatever was going on around her was real. He was sure she was smart enough to have tried to handle it alone before calling him, which meant she'd run out of better options. He was sure he didn't have enough information to assess the actual level of threat, which bothered him in the specific way that incomplete intelligence had always bothered him. Not as fear exactly, but as an itch he couldn't reach. He was less sure about everything else. Emma spotted Victoria before he did, which wasn't a surprise because Emma had a gift for locating new people in any environment that bordered on supernatural. "Is that the lady?" Emma said. "What lady?" "The one Kyle told Dad Harwick told him you pulled out of the creek." He pulled into the parking area. "How much did you hear through that vent?" "A lot," Emma said, with complete serenity. Victoria was on a bench near the water, in a heavy coat this time, which was the first choice she'd made that acknowledged the temperature. She stood when she saw them. She looked, Ethan noticed, slightly uncertain. The particular uncertainty of someone who spends most of their professional life in rooms where they control the terms of engagement and is now standing in a public park about to meet a 7-year-old. Emma walked directly up to her. "Hi," she said. "I'm Emma. My dad pulled you out of a creek." "Emma," Ethan said. "He said it's private," Emma said to Victoria. "But you already know about it, so it's not private anymore." Victoria looked down at Emma with an expression that started as something careful and professional and then shifted into something more genuine, a surprise kind of amusement, like a window cracking open. "He did," Victoria said. "I'm Victoria. He tells me about you sometimes." Emma looked at Ethan. "You talk about me?" "You come up," Ethan said. Emma seemed to consider whether this was satisfactory. She decided it was. "Do you want to see the duck?" she said to Victoria. "There's a duck that lives here. He's missing some feathers on his head, and Dad says he probably lost a fight." "I didn't use those exact words," Ethan said. "He said the duck has a complicated history," Emma said. "I'm pretty sure that means he lost a fight." Victoria looked at Ethan over Emma's head. He shrugged minimally. She almost smiled, then did smile. A small one, and not the professional version, which he was coming to recognize as slightly too deliberate in its warmth. This was a different kind. The three of them walked along the trail to find the duck, which Emma located with impressive certainty about halfway down the east bank, and Ethan and Victoria walked behind while Emma provided a running commentary on the duck's history, which she had largely invented. "She's wonderful," Victoria said, low enough that Emma wouldn't hear. "She's a lot," he said. "Yes," Victoria said, "that's what I meant." They walked. The creek was slower now than it had been during the storm, moving with a lazy fall afternoon heaviness. The light was going golden through the trees. Emma had crouched down near the bank and was having a one-sided conversation with the duck, who was ignoring her with immense dignity. "5 years ago," Victoria said, Vantage Medical acquired a smaller company that had been developing a pediatric cardiac device, a stent delivery system specifically designed for children with congenital defects, kids who currently have very limited treatment options, who go through repeat surgeries, who don't always make it to adulthood. She paused. The research was extraordinary, genuinely breakthrough level, the kind of thing that comes along maybe once in a decade. Ethan listened. When Vantage absorbed the company, the research came with it. The team that developed it was brought in. Standard acquisition. Her voice was even, but it had the quality of something being spoken carefully, each word placed with intent. And then, 18 months later, the board voted to shelve it indefinitely. Why? Because Vantage also owns a product line of surgical tools and support equipment that's currently the standard of care for the surgeries these children undergo. The ones that don't always work. She looked at the water. A device that eliminates the need for those surgeries is not, from a certain financial perspective, good news for that product line. He was quiet. $300 million in annual revenue, she said. That's what those surgical products bring in. The pediatric device would have replaced most of that within 4 years. And you're the CEO. I'm the CEO who inherited that decision. I came in after the shelving. I didn't know about it until 8 months into the role. She picked up a small stone from the path and held it in her palm without throwing it. When I found out, I pushed to reverse it. The board pushed back. I pushed harder. They started restricting things. My access to certain files. My communications going through compliance review. A culture of watching that got less subtle over time. And the man outside your hotel. She set the stone back down on the path instead of throwing it. That was not the first time. Ethan watched Emma try to offer the duck something she'd found in her jacket pocket, a fruit snack, the little bear-shaped kind, and watched the duck assess it and decline. "What do you want to do with this?" he said. She looked at him. It was the first time the question had been asked that plainly, and he could see her sit with it, not the public answer, not the CEO answer, but the actual answer. "I want to get the research out," she said, "the full files. There are encrypted records, the original clinical trial data, the suppression memos, the financial projections they used to justify the decision. If that gets to independent investigators, to the right lawmakers, it doesn't stay buried." She paused. "I've been trying to access it safely for 4 months. I'm running out of time." "Why now?" he said. "Why here?" "In Millhaven." She looked at the creek. The evening light made the water look like hammered copper. "I was driving to a meeting in Lexington," she said. "The meeting was with a congressional aide who'd agreed to hear me out. And then it wasn't. The meeting was canceled an hour before, and I was rerouted, and I don't know if that's coincidence and I'm becoming paranoid, or if it was deliberate and I'm not paranoid enough." She stopped. "And then I drove into a guardrail in a rainstorm and woke up on a creek bank with your jacket on." Emma had given up on the duck and was now throwing small pebbles into the water with focused concentration, each one landing with a small plop that satisfied her in some way visible only to 7-year-olds. "I'm not in a position to help you with any of that," Ethan said. It was honest, and he said it without apology. "I'm a mechanic in a town of 4,000 people. I don't have contacts anymore. I don't have resources." "I know," she said. "So what are you asking me for?" She looked at him directly, and for a moment all the management was gone. The careful pacing of information, the controlled presentation. It was just a person who was tired and running on the particular fuel of someone who had been holding too much alone for too long. "Right now," she said, "I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to tell someone who wasn't going to report it to a board member." He held that. "Okay," he said. They sat on the bench near the water while Emma wore herself out on the trail, running ahead and doubling back the way kids do when they've had a full day and are about 45 minutes from a hard crash. Victoria had a thermos of coffee she'd brought, black, no additions, which Ethan accepted when she offered it because he was cold and it was there. They talked in the way that people talk when the big conversation has been had and they're both settling around it. She asked him about the shop, about how long he'd been running it. He told her about his uncle, about the handwritten note, about learning to rebuild an engine at 13 in the way that felt like learning a language, the satisfaction of a thing that had a specific right answer. She told him she'd grown up in Indiana, that she'd had one sibling, a younger sister. She said had and didn't expand on it, and he didn't ask, but the past tense landed, and he noted it. You went into medical devices specifically, he said. Yes. After your sister. She looked at him. You're perceptive. You said had. She looked down at the thermos. Sophie. She had a congenital heart condition, pulmonary valve stenosis. She was supposed to have the procedure when she was 9. A pause. She was 8 when there were complications they couldn't manage. She didn't make it to the procedure. He didn't say he was sorry. Not because he wasn't, but because I'm sorry in these moments was often more about the speaker's discomfort than the listener's grief. And she didn't seem to need managing. She seemed to need the space to have said it. Is that why the pediatric device specifically matters to you? He said. Partly. She handed him back the thermos. Partly it matters because it's right. Those are different things, and I try not to confuse them. He looked at her sideways. Most people would combine them, make the personal into the mission. The personal makes me stubborn, she said. The mission requires more than stubbornness. Emma came running back at full speed and landed against Ethan's legs like a small freight vehicle, slightly out of breath and reporting that she had found a second duck on the north end of the trail, and this one still had all its feathers, which she considered evidence of superior strategy. Victoria listened to Emma's duck analysis with what appeared to be genuine engagement, asking 2 follow-up questions that Emma received with great seriousness. On the walk back to the parking lot, Emma put her hand in Victoria's without asking, just slid it in, the way children do with people they've decided are acceptable, which is a decision they make on criteria invisible to adults and which cannot be argued with. Victoria looked down at Emma's hand in hers, and something moved through her expression that was private and complicated and not for Ethan to catalog. At the cars, Emma said goodbye with a wave and climbed into the truck and immediately fell asleep against the window, which was what Ethan had predicted internally within about the first 10 minutes of the walk. Victoria stood at her Volvo. Thank you for this. She decided you were okay, he said. That's usually accurate. High standard. She doesn't like people who are fake nice, he said. She has a nose for it. Victoria nodded slowly, like she was filing that too. She's going to be formidable. She already is, he said. She's just small about it currently. He got in the truck. Emma barely stirred. He adjusted the heat and pulled out of the lot and watched in the rear view until Victoria's Volvo headlights came on, and she turned north on Route 7. The next week went on the way normal weeks did in Millhaven. He did the brake job and the oil change and finally completed the transmission flush when the customer showed up without rescheduling for once. He coached Emma's Saturday soccer practice and stood in the cold watching 8 7-year-olds interpret the word formation in about 7 different ways, which he'd learned early was simply what 7-year-olds did with formations and was not a fixable problem. Victoria was in town through the week. She didn't explain why. He didn't ask. She came by the shop twice, not with appointments, just to talk, which he found he didn't mind in the way he'd expected to mind it. She had a quality of attention when she listened that was unusual. She listened the way people only listened when they weren't simultaneously composing their own response. Tuesday. She appeared at the shop door with 2 coffees from the gas station down the street. The bad coffee, the kind in the styrofoam cup with the plastic lid that bent when you tried to drink from it, and she sat on the stool near the workbench while he pulled the fuel injector on a 2015 Silverado, and they talked about whether a 7-year-old could be genuinely bored or whether boredom in children was actually just understimulation needing redirection, which was not a conversation he'd expected to have with a CEO and which he found oddly engaging. Thursday. She was pale in a way that was different from her baseline. Another call last night, he said. She looked at him. You look like someone who slept 3 hours, he said. 2, she said. There were emails from a Vantage corporate account through a proxy server. It wasn't hard to trace back to the source. She put her coffee down. Advising me to stop communicating with third parties about internal company matters. Advising me warmly and with a lot of legal language. Is that a threat? It's a reminder, she said, that they're watching, which is itself the threat. She looked at her hands, then at him. I had a lawyer 2 months ago, personal attorney, someone I trusted. After I told him what I was dealing with, he stopped returning calls. Then I found out he'd been retained by Vantage's holding company. They bought your lawyer. Retained, she said, with a bitterness that was mostly dry. The legal term is retained. He set down the wrench, looked at her squarely. Victoria, what does this look like if it gets worse? What's the move they'd actually make against you? She met his eyes. And again, briefly, the management went down. They've already filed preliminary paperwork with the SEC suggesting I misappropriated research assets during the acquisition period. It's not a real case. There's no evidence because I didn't do it. But it doesn't need to be a real case. It needs to create enough noise that any investigation I initiate looks like it's coming from someone with a motive to deflect. They flip the narrative. I become the fugitive, and the research stays buried. The word fugitive sat in the air between them with a weight that neither of them acknowledged directly. And the evidence, he said. The encrypted files. Where are they? Safe, she said. For now. She didn't say where. He didn't push. But the way she'd said for now told him something about what she thought the timeline looked like. He picked up the wrench again. He worked for a while without talking, and she sat on the stool and drank the bad coffee and watched him work. And there was something in the silence that was comfortable in a way he wasn't completely prepared for. Not easy, exactly, but honest. Two people who had both learned to be alone in their particular ways, sitting in the same room with the same weather coming at them from outside. My daughter, he said eventually, not looking up from the injector. She has about 6 more years before she's old enough that my decisions stop affecting her directly. He paused. I want you to understand that I'm aware of that. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Are you telling me to stay away? I'm telling you I know what I'm doing, he said. And I want you to know I know. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, okay, he said. Miss it. Saturday night, past 9 o'clock, she called again. This time her voice was tight in a different way. Not the slow-building anxiety of Wednesday's lot, but something more acute. Something that had a time pressure behind it. They know I'm in Millhaven, she said. How? My phone. I was careful, but not careful enough. She was moving. He could hear it, her breath slightly elevated, the ambient sound shifting around her. There are 2 cars. I saw them when I left the hotel. They're not following directly, but they're paralleling me on side streets, and that's actually worse because it means they know where I'm going. Where are you going? Silence for 2 seconds. I didn't have anywhere else to go, she said. He was already at the front door. How far out are you? 3 minutes. Come to the shop. Go around the back. There's a roll-up door on the alley side. I'll have it open. He had it open in 90 seconds. He had Emma's bedroom door closed in 95. He moved the lights in the front of the shop to their minimum, leaving only the work lights on in the bay. Her rental car came around the corner of the alley at a speed that said she'd taken the turn slightly too fast. She pulled in. He rolled the door down behind her. She got out of the car. She was carrying a laptop bag over one shoulder and her jacket was only half on, pushed off one shoulder in the way of someone who'd grabbed it running. There was a small cut on the back of her left hand, new, not from the accident, probably from something she'd caught on a door or a wall in the dark. She stopped in the middle of the bay and looked at him, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked genuinely scared. Not managed scared, not careful scared, just scared, the way people look when the thing they've been outrunning has gotten close enough to feel its breath. They were right outside the hotel, she said. Okay. This is too much, she said. I'm putting you in the middle of... Sit down, he said. She sat on the stool. Her laptop bag slid off her shoulder onto the floor, and she let it go, which told him something about how depleted she was. He got her a glass of water from the sink in the back, stood across from her while she drank it, watched the color come back to her face incrementally. You're staying here tonight, he said. She started to say something. I've got a couch in the office, he said. It's not comfortable, but it locks from the inside, and there's no reason anyone would look for you here. In the morning, we figure out next steps. She looked around the shop, the toolboxes, the lifts, the half-finished Silverado in the far bay, and then she looked at him. You live upstairs, she said. Above the shop. Emma's up there. He paused. I'll be down here. She understood what he was telling her, and what he wasn't. He wasn't offering her a place to hide out of misplaced heroism or because he'd underestimated what she was carrying. He was offering it because it was the most practical, safe option available in the next 8 hours, and he was a man who dealt in practical. She didn't say thank you. She said, "I'll be gone before Emma wakes up." 7 a.m., he said. "She wakes at 7. 6:30, she said. He nodded. He brought a blanket down from upstairs and a pillow from the spare room, and he set them on the office couch and left the space heater on low. The office had one window that faced the alley, and he checked it and locked it and lowered the blind. Before he went back upstairs, he stood in the doorway for a moment. She was sitting on his couch with the blanket around her shoulders and her laptop open on her knees. And she was already working, back straight, reading something on the screen, the fear from 20 minutes ago tucked away somewhere. Not gone, just stored. That was, he thought, an extraordinary amount of discipline for someone sitting on a shop couch at 9:30 at night with no backup and nowhere safe to go. "There's a deadbolt," he said. "Slide it after I leave." She looked up, and for just a second before she went back to her screen, she looked at him with an expression that was neither managed nor performed. It was just a person who had been fighting alone for a long time, sitting in the first place that had felt, in a while, like it had walls. He went upstairs. He heard the deadbolt slide. He checked Emma, still deeply asleep, the rabbit on the floor again, and went to his own room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and thought about what she'd told him, about the research and the files and the children who were still waiting for something that had already been invented and was sitting in an encrypted folder somewhere because $300 million a year was a number that felt, to certain people, more real than a child's life. He thought about Emma's question from the other morning. Can you still have something if it's gone? He lay back and looked at the ceiling. Yeah, he thought, you can. But sometimes you have to fight like hell to keep it from disappearing completely. She was gone when he came downstairs at 6:28. The blanket was folded on the arm of the couch. Not in the way a hotel housekeeper folds things, but in the imperfect, careful way of someone who wanted to leave the space better than they'd found it and didn't have much time. The pillow was stacked on top. The space heater had been turned off. On the corner of his desk, she'd left his shop coffee mug, which he hadn't given her, which meant she'd found it herself, rinsed it, and placed it upright where he'd see it. He stood in the office doorway for a moment. There was a folded piece of paper under the mug. Shop receipt paper from the roll by the register. She'd written on the blank side in small, precise handwriting, "Thank you. I'll be in touch when it's safer. V." He read it once, put it in his shirt pocket, and went upstairs to make Emma breakfast. She did not call Sunday. She did not call Monday. Tuesday, he found himself checking his phone with a frequency he recognized as unhealthy and told himself to stop. He stopped checking it, which meant he was thinking about checking it constantly instead of actually doing it, which was worse. Emma noticed he was distracted at dinner Tuesday night. She noticed in the way children notice, not by asking about it directly, but by being unusually quiet herself, matching his energy in a way that made him feel the silence of the kitchen more acutely. "Are you worried about someone?" she said, over her pasta. "Just thinking about work," he said. Emma assessed this for a second. "The fuel injector?" "Something like that." She ate another bite. "Victoria's nice," she said. He looked up. "I liked her," Emma said. "She listened to the whole duck thing. Some adults start nodding before you're done talking." "She seems like someone who pays attention," he said. "Yeah." Emma stabbed a piece of pasta. "Is she in trouble?" "Why do you ask that?" "Because you looked at her the same way you look at things at the shop when they're almost broken," Emma said. "Not broken yet, but almost." He didn't have anything to say to that. He sat with it and finished his dinner. But Wednesday morning, he was under a Jeep Cherokee doing exhaust work when Kyle, his part-time help, came to the bay door and said there were 2 men in the front asking for Ethan Knox. He knew before he came out from under the vehicle that they weren't there about a car. They were federal. He could see it the moment he stepped into the front area. The particular quality of stillness that federal agents maintained in civilian environments, slightly too controlled for casual visitors, their eyes doing a slow sweep of the space the way all trained people swept spaces, both in their 40s. One in a gray suit, one in a navy windbreaker, with no visible insignia. They had the look of people who did not enjoy small towns and were making polite efforts to conceal this. Gray suit produced a badge. Mr. Knox, Special Agent Drummond, FBI. This is Agent Reyes. He indicated the windbreaker. We have a few questions if you have a moment. About what? Ethan said. About a woman named Victoria Hayes. Kyle was hovering near the parts counter with the specific anxiety of someone who desperately wanted to be somewhere else. Ethan tilted his head toward the office. They sat. Ethan stood. Drummond put a photograph on the desk without preamble. A professional headshot. Dark blazer, direct look at the camera, the kind of photo used in annual reports and corporate websites. The woman in it was Victoria. Unmistakably, Victoria. Same eyes, same set of the jaw. You know her? Drummond said. We've met, Ethan said. She came by to thank me for helping after an accident on Route 7. That's been in the local traffic report. When did you last see her? Last week sometime. The receipt paper with V on it was still in his shirt pocket. He was aware of it. Did she indicate where she was going? Any travel plans? We didn't talk about that. Reyes leaned forward slightly. Mr. Knox, are you aware that Victoria Hayes is currently the subject of a federal investigation? Ethan looked at him evenly. I wasn't, no. Drummond slid a second document across the desk. Not a photograph this time. A summary page, the kind assembled for field briefings. He let Ethan read the first section. It laid out in flat federal prose an allegation that Victoria Hayes, CEO of Vantage Medical Technologies, had in the past 6 months systematically accessed and removed classified proprietary research assets belonging to Vantage's parent holding company, Meridian Biogroup. Research valued, the document said, at approximately $800 million. That she had copied encrypted clinical files, suppressed internal audits, and was believed to have arranged transmission of those files to parties outside the company, that a federal warrant had been issued, that she was currently a fugitive. Ethan read it and handed it back. That's a serious set of allegations, he said. Yes, Drummond said. It is, which is why it's important that anyone who's been in contact with Ms. Hayes understands their own exposure here. He paused to let that land. Knowingly assisting a federal fugitive, Mr. Knox, that carries its own consequences. Ethan looked at him steadily. I helped a woman after a car accident. She came by to say thank you. I don't know anything about federal warrants or classified files. Drummond held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once and picked up the documents. If she contacts you, he said, or if you remember anything that might be relevant to her location, I'd appreciate a call. He put a card on the desk. Sure, Ethan said. He walked them out. He stood on the front step of the shop and watched the unmarked sedan pull out of the lot and turn onto Birch Street heading north. Then he went back inside and stood in the office alone for a minute with the card in his hand. He set the card on the corner of the desk, precisely where she'd left his coffee mug. He went back under the Jeep. He thought about what she'd told him. He thought about it the way he thought through operational problems, methodically, without letting the emotional weight of it crowd out the clarity he needed. She had told him the board had accused her of misappropriating research. She'd told him it would happen. She'd described it as a narrative flip. Make her the criminal so the real crime stays invisible. Now it had happened. The question was whether the federal agents were acting on a legitimate complaint, or whether Meridian Biogroup, which was an $800 million entity with the resources and connections to make a call to the right people, had accelerated the process. Both were possible. He didn't have enough information to know which one was true, and he understood clearly that he should not trust his own inclination to believe her version of events over the official version simply because he liked her. He also understood that the document Drummond had shown him described a woman who had stolen proprietary research. It did not describe why. It described the what and omitted everything that came before it, which was, in his experience, exactly how documents like that were designed. He surfaced from under the Jeep at noon, ate his lunch. Kyle asked if everything was okay with a transparency that made Ethan appreciate the kid's sincerity, even as he said yes, fine, go finish the oil drain on the Civic. He picked Emma up at 3. She talked the entire drive home about a project they were doing in class on state birds, and whether it was fair that Kentucky's state bird was the cardinal when clearly the mockingbird was more interesting. And Ethan listened and agreed that the mockingbird had a stronger resume and felt, for that 15-minute drive, almost entirely present. He made dinner, He helped Emma with the state bird project. He read to her at bedtime. They were in the middle of a chapter book about a girl who found a door in the back of her closet, and Emma had opinions about every character that she shared between chapters with great conviction. After she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table and thought. She told him the files were safe. She hadn't told him where. He hadn't asked because she hadn't offered it, and because at the time it seemed like information that was safer not to know. Now the calculus had shifted. She was a named federal fugitive. 2 agents had come to his shop. The gap between I'm aware of this situation and I'm actively involved in this situation was narrowing in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. He went to bed. He lay awake for 2 hours. At 11:40, his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered it on the second ring. There was a silence at first, and then she said his name. Not Mr. Knox this time, just Ethan. And the way she said it told him everything about what kind of 2 weeks she'd had. Are you safe? He said. Right now, yes. Her voice was different on this call. Stripped of the management, stripped of the careful pacing. She sounded exhausted in the particular way of someone who has been running for a long time and has just stopped moving for the first time. I know they came to see you. This morning. I'm sorry, she said. I tried to make sure nothing connected back to you. I know you did. A pause. The road noise was absent this time. She was somewhere still. Victoria, he said. Natalie, she said. He stopped. My name is Natalie Cross. The words came out steady, but underneath them was the specific exhaustion of someone who has been someone else for long enough that saying their own name feels strange. Victoria Hayes is a legal identity I've maintained for 4 years. It's real enough, but legally established, professionally documented, but it's not who I am. He sat with that for a moment. Okay, he said. That's it? She sounded almost surprised. What else do you want me to say? She was quiet. Then, most people would have more of a reaction to finding out someone lied to them for 3 weeks. You didn't lie to me, he said. You told me you were running. You told me there were people who wanted to stop what you were doing. You told me why. He paused. The name is a detail. It's not a small detail. No, he said. It isn't. But the rest of it holds. Another silence, longer. Then she exhaled, and in that exhale was something releasing, the held posture of someone who'd been braced for a different reaction. Natalie Cross, he said. Where does that come from? Indiana, same as the rest of it. My father was a machinist. My mother taught piano. I was the first one in my family to finish college. A pause. Sophie was going to be the second. Your sister. Her condition was called pulmonary valve stenosis, she said. There was a procedure she was supposed to have, a catheter-based repair. Standard of care for that diagnosis. She was scheduled, and then the specialist we needed wasn't available, and the backup had a credential issue, and there was a scheduling delay that turned into a week, and the week turned into a complication, and her voice went briefly unsteady and then steadied. She was 8 years old, and the technology to help her existed. It just didn't get to her in time. I'm sorry, he said, and this time the words meant something specific. I went into biomedical engineering because of her, Natalie said, specifically into cardiac device development. I spent 6 years in R&D before I moved into corporate. I thought if I was in the room where decisions were made, I could make better ones. A dry sound that was almost a laugh. That's a very optimistic way to think about how corporations work. What happened to the research, he said. The original development, before Vantage acquired it. I led it, she said. That's the part they left out of every document they've filed. The pediatric stent delivery system, the bridge heart device. That was mine. My team's. We developed it at a smaller company called Helix Medical Solutions for 5 years before Meridian Bio Group acquired Helix. The research came with the acquisition. I came with the acquisition. Another pause. 18 months later, they shelved it. I went to the board. I documented everything. I went to my own lawyer, who turned out to be their lawyer, and then I realized the only way to get the research out was to take it myself. The encrypted files. The full clinical trial data, the suppression memos, the internal financial modeling that shows they chose $300 million in annual revenue over a device that would have been in hospitals within 2 years. Her voice had gone quieter, more focused. I copied everything before they could restrict my access further. I moved it. I've been trying to get it to the right people for 4 months. The congressional meeting that was canceled. That was the third attempt. A beat. Someone in that aide's office told someone at Meridian. I don't know who. I stopped trusting institutional channels after that. Ethan looked at the dark window of his kitchen, the yard outside, the strip of light from the neighbor's porch, the same quiet Tuesday night neighborhood that had been there every night for 2 years. The files, he said. Where are they? She was quiet for a moment. I know you're asking because you want to help, she said, and I know I should probably let you. Then let me. If I tell you where they are, she said, and something goes wrong, if Drummond comes back, if Meridian finds out about the shop, that's a risk I'm deciding to take, he said, not you deciding it for me. She didn't respond immediately. He could hear her breathing, thinking, the weight of whether to trust someone with something that had cost her everything it had cost her. There's a storage facility, she said finally, Midway Self-Storage on Harrison Pike, outside of Frankfurt. Unit 44. The combination on the lock is 4 digits. She paused. Emma's birthday. He went still. I know that's an intrusion, she said quickly. I needed something I could remember that they couldn't find in any search, and She stopped. I'm sorry. That was too far. When did you set that up? He said. The day after the park, she said. After I drove back to Nashville, I moved the drive to a new location. The day after the park, after Emma had put her hand in hers on the trail, after the duck with the complicated history. You trusted us before you trusted me, he said. She has better instincts, Natalie said, and then very quietly. So did I once. He looked at his kitchen table, at the Drummond card on the corner of it. The drive, he said. What's on it? Is it enough? Without you there to testify, without context, is there enough for an investigator to act on? The suppression memos are signed, she said, by Meridian's CEO and 2 board members. The financial modeling has a date stamp from 3 weeks after they acquired Bridgeheart, which means they knew what they were shelving and why before they even finished the acquisition paperwork. A pause. If the right investigator gets those files, Meridian can't bury it, not with those signatures. What's the right investigator? There's a congressional subcommittee, she said. Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. Subcommittee on Primary Health and Retirement Security. There's a staffer there named Greenwald, David Greenwald, who's been investigating pharmaceutical suppression practices for 2 years, independent of any corporate contact. His number is in the notes file on the drive, in a folder called Admin. Ethan memorized it. Natalie, he said. The name was still new in his mouth, a little unfamiliar. Are you coming back? A silence. I don't know, she said. Drummond has a real warrant. The charges are technically valid. I did remove the files. I did it because the files were mine, but the documentation of that is complex and would take time to establish in court, and time is what Meridian is betting I don't have. Her voice was measured, the emotion in it present but controlled, like a hand pressed flat over something that wanted to move. There's a hearing scheduled for next month. Senate Subcommittee, Pharmaceutical Suppression. Greenwald's been building toward it. If the files reach him before that hearing, the story changes, Ethan said. The story becomes something they can't kill, she said. He looked at the Drummond card again. You have to understand something, she said. If you do this, if you go to that unit and you take that drive and you get it to Greenwald, you will be in federal territory. You will have handled evidence in an active federal investigation. They can make that complicated for you. I know. You have Emma, she said. I know, he said again. She was quiet. He could hear what she wasn't saying, that she had no right to ask this, that she'd already asked too much, that she'd pulled him into something that had been hers to carry and had put it in his hands without a clean way for him to put it down. I'm not asking you to do this, she said. I know you're not. Then why? Because you're telling me where the drive is, he said. And you know what I'm going to do with the information, and you're telling me anyway. A long pause. Yes, she said. Then we both know what's happening here, he said. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Outside his window, the neighbor's porch light went off and the yard got darker. There's something else, she said. Her voice had shifted again, flatter, more deliberate. On the drive, in the same admin folder, there's a file named Knox,E. Don't open it before you deliver the drive. What is it? It's a notarized statement I prepared with a private notary in Nashville. It documents the timeline of our contact, that I approached you, that I concealed information from you initially, that you had no knowledge of the warrant or the investigation until federal agents informed you. Her voice was careful and matter-of-fact. It's structured to establish your clean hands position. If anyone tries to use your involvement against you, that document exists. He sat with that for a moment. You had that prepared before tonight? Yes. You were protecting me before I knew I needed protecting. You have Emma, she said again, and in those 3 words was everything she didn't say. The weight she'd given Emma's existence, the way she'd factored a 7-year-old girl into her calculus without being asked to. A woman who had lost a sister and had never stopped factoring children into every equation since. Take care of yourself, he said. I'm trying. Natalie. Yeah. Sophie would be proud of you. A silence that lasted long enough that he thought the call had dropped. Then, very quietly, just 2 words. Drive carefully. She hung up. He sat at the kitchen table for a while in the dark. Then he went to Emma's room and stood in the doorway and listened to her sleep, and thought about what a notarized statement prepared by a woman who had nothing left to protect except other people looked like, and what it cost to prepare it, and what kind of person did that when they were already running. He thought about a little girl in Indiana who died at 8 years old waiting for something that had already existed. He thought about Emma's question. Can you still have something if it's gone? He went to bed. He drove to Frankfurt the next morning. He told Kyle there was a parts supplier he needed to see in person and to hold down the shop and call him if anything urgent came up. Kyle said sure and asked if he needed anything from the Dairy Queen on Route 60 because Kyle had a thing about their soft serve that he'd never fully explained and pursued regardless of weather or emotional context. Ethan said no. Midway Self-Storage on Harrison Pike was a beige single-story facility of the kind that existed in every mid-size American town. Practical, unremarkable, slightly exhausted looking at the edges. A wire fence, a keypad at the gate. Units running along 3 rows, each with an orange roll-up door. Unit 44 was at the end of the 2nd row. The lock was a standard combination padlock. He turned the dial to Emma's birthday, felt the click, and the shackle released. Inside the unit, a folding chair, a plastic storage bin, a half-empty case of bottled water that had been there long enough to collect a thin layer of dust. And on top of the bin, a small padded envelope sealed with packing tape with a USB drive inside. He held it in his palm. It was smaller than his thumb. He put it in his jacket pocket. He locked the unit back up, drove to the gate, and sat in the parking lot for a minute. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. He had the specific quality of stillness that came over him in moments of committed action. Not peace exactly, but resolution. The feeling of a decision already made settling into the body. He drove back to Millhaven. He picked Emma up from school at 3 o'clock. She said there had been a thing in PE class involving a jump rope and Tyler Mast, and she was deeply dissatisfied with how the teacher had handled it, and the story took 17 minutes to fully tell and involved a level of structural detail that would have served her well in litigation. He listened to every word. At home, he made grilled cheese and tomato soup, and after dinner, Emma drew pictures at the kitchen table while he sat across from her and looked up the Senate subcommittee online and found a contact number for David Greenwald's office, and wrote the number on a piece of paper and put it in his wallet. Emma held up her drawing. It was a duck, clearly identifiable by its small size and the lines suggesting missing feathers on the head. Is it good? She said. It's great, he said. Do you think I should give it to Victoria? Emma said. Since she saw the duck too. He looked at the drawing. I think she'd like that, he said. We'll hold on to it for now. Emma nodded seriously and went back to drawing. He folded the paper with Greenwald's number in his wallet and looked at his daughter's bent head and the careful imprecision of her lines. The duck rendered in purple crayon because she'd decided purple was more interesting than brown, and he sat in the ordinary kitchen light of a Wednesday evening in Mill Haven, Kentucky, with a USB drive in his jacket pocket containing $800 million worth of truth. He called Greenwald's office the following morning from the shop, before Kyle arrived, with the bay door still down and the coffee still too hot to drink. He identified himself. He said he had materials relevant to the subcommittee's upcoming pharmaceutical suppression hearing. He said the materials included signed suppression documentation from Meridian Bio Group and the original clinical data for a shelved pediatric cardiac device. There was a pause on the line. Then Greenwald's assistant asked if he could hold. He held for 4 minutes. Then a man's voice, careful, professional, the specific alertness of someone who had been doing this work long enough to know when something real had landed. "Mr. Knox, David Greenwald, tell me what you have." Ethan told him. He kept it clear, sequential, no editorializing, just the facts he knew, the facts Natalie had given him, and the contents of the drive as she'd described them. He spoke for 8 minutes. Greenwald asked 2 clarifying questions. He answered them. Then Greenwald said, "Mr. Knox, I need to ask you directly. Is the woman who provided this information safe?" Ethan looked at the coffee mug on the corner of his desk, the empty space where her note had been. "I don't know," he said. A silence. "I'm going to give you a secure email address," Greenwald said. "I need you to send the drive contents to that address. Encrypted. There's a procedure to each." "I know the procedure," Ethan said. Greenwald paused at that. Then, "I see. All right. How soon can you do this?" "Today," Ethan said. He looked at the bay door. Through the bottom gap, where it didn't quite seal, he could see the thin line of morning light at the bottom. The day had started already without him, the way days did, indifferent to everything a person was carrying inside it. "Mr. Knox," Greenwald said, "I want to be straightforward with you. If these files contain what you're describing, this is going to get complicated before it gets better." "Yeah," Ethan said. "I figured that." The encrypted transfer took 40 minutes. Ethan used the shop's back-office computer, a machine old enough that Kyle had once called it a historical artifact, and followed the secure protocol Greenwald's office had emailed to him, a process that involved 2 verification codes, a hash confirmation, and a final authentication step that required him to photograph the drive itself as proof of physical possession. He did all of it methodically, without rushing. When the confirmation came back, a single line of text saying transfer received and verified, 11:47 a.m. He sat back in the chair and let out a breath he hadn't fully realized he was holding. He locked the drive in the small lockbox bolted to the underside of his desk. The box held his shop insurance documents, and Emma's spare medication, and a photograph he kept because he kept it, not because he looked at it often. The drive fit in the remaining space without crowding anything. Then he opened the shop and did the rest of the day's work. There was a transmission job on a 2018 Ram that needed his full attention and got it, which was part of why he chose to start with it. Full attention jobs were useful when you needed to keep your mind from running laps around things you couldn't currently act on. He worked until 6, closed up, picked up Emma from the after-school program, and drove home without the radio on. Emma was in a good mood. Something had happened with the jump rope situation that had resolved in her favor, and she narrated the resolution in satisfying detail for most of the drive. He listened and said the right things and made dinner, and later, after she was in bed, he sat with a beer he barely drank and looked at his phone and thought about Natalie Cross somewhere out there in the quiet of a country that had a warrant with her name on it. He did not hear from Greenwald until the following Monday. The call came mid-morning, while he had his head under the hood of a Subaru Outback with a coolant leak. Kyle took the message and came out to the bay with the number written on a paper towel, which was the shop's informal message system. Ethan called back from the office with the door closed. "The files are exactly what you described," Greenwald said. No preamble, no small talk. The man was efficient in a way Ethan respected. "The suppression memos are dated. The signatures are verifiable. The financial modeling document is, frankly, it's damning in a way that doesn't require any interpretation. It's explicit." "What does that mean in terms of the hearing?" "It means we have material evidence of a deliberate decision to suppress a life-saving pediatric device for profit, documented by the executives who made that decision." A pause. We're requesting expedited placement on the subcommittee agenda. That's not guaranteed, but with evidence this specific, I think we can make the case. And the warrant on Natalie Cross? A silence that lasted long enough to mean something. That's more complicated, Greenwald said. The warrant is real. It was issued through legitimate federal channels, which means unwinding it isn't something my office can do unilaterally. What we can do is ensure that the investigative record includes documentation of origin, that the Bridgeheart research originated with her, that the acquisition documentation supports her claim of authorship, and that the removal of files was responsive to documented suppression of her own work. Another pause. That doesn't make the warrant disappear overnight, but it changes the context significantly. How significantly? Significantly enough that a federal prosecutor would need to make a choice about whether pursuing a case against the person who exposed the fraud serves the public interest, Greenwald said. That's a calculation prosecutors don't love making in public. Ethan thought about what she'd said on the phone. Time is what Meridian is betting I don't have. How long does your process take, he said. Expedited means 4 to 6 weeks to hearing placement, Greenwald said. Evidence review is concurrent. We have investigators who can begin working with the files immediately. She might not have 4 to 6 weeks. I know. Greenwald's voice carried the specific weight of someone who understood the gap between institutional timelines and human ones and had spent a career trying to close it. Mr. Knox, I need to ask, do you have any way to contact her? The number I had is no longer active, he said, which was true. He'd tried it twice since the night of the phone call and gotten a disconnected tone both times. If she reaches out to you, Greenwald said, I want you to tell her something. Tell her that as of this morning, my office has formally contacted the FBI field office handling her case and requested a records review based on new evidence. That doesn't stop the warrant, but it creates a paper trail that any competent defense attorney can use. Tell her to find a competent defense attorney. I'll tell her if I can, Ethan said. After he hung up, he sat in the office for a while. Through the window that overlooked the bay, he could see Kyle rotating tires on a Camry with the cheerful incompetence he brought to all physical tasks, and which somehow always produced acceptable results. Ethan thought about Natalie Cross, wherever she was, whether she was eating, whether she was sleeping, whether she was still running or had found somewhere to stop. He thought about the notarized statement she'd prepared with his name on it, filed under Knox, E, protecting him before she'd ever told him about the drive, before she'd even asked him to do anything. The kind of thinking that went into that, the specific care of it, the way she'd worked backward from his exposure before she'd created it, that was not the thinking of someone reckless. That was the thinking of someone who had been living with the weight of other people's safety for so long, it had become the baseline. He went back out to the Subaru. Agent Drummond came back Thursday. This time he came alone, no Reyes, and he came without the performance of the first visit. No document on the desk, no badge production, just a man who pulled into the lot in the same unmarked sedan and came into the front and said, "You got a minute?" in the tone of someone who already knew the answer. Ethan led him to the office again. Drummond sat. He didn't put anything on the desk. He looked at Ethan with the look of a man who was recalibrating. "You made contact with David Greenwald's office," Drummond said. "That's not a question," Ethan said. "No." Drummond's hands were flat on the desk, relaxed. It was a studied posture, controlled neutral, designed to create reciprocal calm. Ethan had used it himself in different contexts. "When I was here before, you said you didn't know about the federal investigation." "I didn't. Not until you told me." "But you subsequently contacted a Senate investigator with materials relevant to that investigation." "I provided information I became aware of," Ethan said. "That's not a crime." "No," Drummond agreed. "It's not." He looked at Ethan steadily. "I'm not here to threaten you, Mr. Knox. I want to be clear about that." "Okay. I'm here because my office received a records review request from Greenwald's investigators, and that request included documentation of the Bridgeheart research that is, it's substantive." He paused on the word like he was testing it. "Substantive in a way that changes some of our assumptions about the shape of this case." "The research was hers," Ethan said. Drummond was quiet for a moment. "Potentially. That's what the review will determine. The acquisition documentation from Helix Medical Solutions shows it was her team's development," Ethan said. The suppression memos are dated 3 weeks post-acquisition. You're looking for a fugitive who took back her own work. Drummond looked at him for a long moment. Something was moving behind his eyes. Not concession, not quite, but the adjustment of a man who had been given a different picture than the one he'd started with. "Where is she?" he said. "I don't know." "Mr. Knox." "I genuinely don't know," Ethan said. "The last number I had for her is disconnected. I have no current contact." Drummond studied him. The study of a man who interviewed people for a living, who had calibrated his ability to read faces over decades of work, who was currently reading Ethan Knox and deciding what he was seeing. "The notarized statement," Drummond said. Ethan didn't react. "Greenwald's office included it in the records request," Drummond said. "Your clean hands documentation. She prepared that before she contacted you about the drive." "Yes." "She protected you before she asked you for anything." "Yes." Drummond was quiet. He looked at the surface of the desk between them. He looked like a man doing a private recalculation, the kind that happens when the story you've been assigned doesn't match the story the evidence is telling. "The warrant is still active," he said finally. "I can't change that from where I sit, but I can tell you that my field office has filed a status update with the U.S. Attorney's Office noting the pending evidence review. What that means in practical terms is that active pursuit is deprioritized while the review is underway." Ethan kept his face neutral. "How long is the review?" "Concurrent with Greenwald's timeline." Drummond stood. He straightened his jacket. "She should know that. If you have any way to communicate that." "I'll keep it in mind," Ethan said. Drummond picked up his card from the corner of the desk, the one he'd left on his first visit, and looked at it and put it back down. "You served," he said. It wasn't a question. "Navy." Drummond nodded once. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his bearing. The small recognition between people who have stood in similar rooms, even if they came to them differently. "My brother was Army," he said. Nothing more than that. He went to the door. "Drummond," Ethan said. The agent turned. "She's not running from conscience," Ethan said. "She's running because the people with the resources to make her look guilty have been doing exactly that for 4 months. You already know that." Drummond held his gaze for a moment. Then he walked out. Ethan listened to the sedan start and pull away. Then he picked up his phone and tried Natalie's disconnected number one more time, not because he expected it to work, but because doing nothing felt like its own kind of failure. The disconnected tone. Same as before. He put the phone down and went back to work. 2 weeks passed. The hearing date was confirmed. Greenwald's office sent a formal notification that the Senate subcommittee had granted expedited placement. The hearing on pharmaceutical suppression practices, which had been scheduled as a general investigative session, was now formally incorporating the Bridgeheart evidence. It was listed as a closed session initially, pending review, which meant no cameras, no press, but also no corporate attorneys in the gallery running interference. Ethan read the notification on his phone in the parking lot of Emma's school while she was still inside finishing something for art class. 4 weeks from now, the thing Natalie Cross had been trying to do for 4 months would be done, one way or another. He thought about calling Greenwald to ask if there was any status on her location. He didn't. Greenwald wasn't in the business of finding people, and asking would only make Ethan's own position look like more than it was. Emma came out of school with a ceramic bowl she'd made in art, slightly lopsided, glazed in an ambitious combination of purple and green. She held it up for his inspection. "It's for you," she said. "For your keys." "It's great," he said. "It's crooked," she said, turning it critically. "So is most of the best stuff," he said. She considered that and decided it was acceptable. She got in the truck and buckled her seatbelt and put the bowl on her lap and held it carefully the whole drive home. The call came on a Tuesday night, 3.5 weeks after Greenwald's confirmation, at 9:18 p.m. Unknown number. Not the same unknown as before. Different digit pattern. He answered it. "It's me." Her voice was low and indoor quiet, which was different from the road and parking lot quality of the previous calls. She was somewhere still and sheltered. "I've been trying to reach you," he said. "I know. I had to change everything. Phone, location, the works." A pause. I've been in Ohio. A friend of Sophie's, from years ago, who has no visible connection to me. She doesn't know the details. She just knew I needed somewhere. Are you okay? Tired, she said. Really tired. She said it plainly, without the management, the way she'd been speaking to him more often in the later calls. Directly, without the layer of professional composure she maintained with the rest of the world. I saw the subcommittee announcement. I've been watching the Federal Register. Well, the hearing is in 11 days, he said. I know. A breath. Ethan, Drummond came to see you again. You knew about that? I have one contact still inside Meridian's legal department, someone who's been watching what they're doing in response to the Greenwald filing. She paused. They're not happy. They've retained 4 additional attorneys in the last 3 weeks. There's been internal movement of assets, documents being moved, reclassified in ways that suggest they're preparing for the hearing to go badly. Destroying evidence? Reclassifying it, which is technically legal and practically the same thing. Her voice had an edge to it now, not anger exactly, but the sharp clarity of someone who had spent years watching a particular machine operate. My contact says there's been discussion of a contingency regarding the source of the Greenwald materials. He went still. Meaning you? Meaning me, she said. They know the files came from me. They don't know how they reached Greenwald, but they know I was the source, and their contingency is, if the hearing proceeds and the evidence is formally entered, they intend to push hard on the warrant. Make the prosecution of the source the story instead of the suppression. Flip the narrative, he said. Yes, she said it quietly. They've been preparing this since the filing. They have the resources to keep this in litigation for 2 years. 2 years in which I'm a named federal fugitive, and the hearing findings are under legal challenge, and the Bridgeheart device stays in regulatory limbo because the evidence chain is disputed. Ethan sat at his kitchen table and thought about that. The cold calculation of it. The way it had been designed not to win outright but to exhaust, to use time and process as weapons, to make the truth too expensive to maintain. What does your contact say the timeline is, he said. If I'm not located and processed before the hearing, their leverage is weaker. The evidence is already with the subcommittee. They can't challenge its authenticity without challenging Greenwald's investigators directly, which is a different kind of fight. But if I turn up in federal custody before the hearing, the story becomes about you. Fugitive CEO arrested days before hearing, she said. Yes, that's the story Meridian's PR firm is ready to run. He was quiet for a moment. His kitchen was dark except for the small light over the stove, and outside the yard was still and cold in the particular way of November in Kentucky. Then don't turn up, he said. I won't, but I can't guarantee they won't find me. She paused. My contact thinks they have a private investigator working parallel to the federal warrant, someone not bound by the procedural delays that are currently slowing Drummond down. Ethan's hand tightened slightly on the phone. Where in Ohio? He said. Ethan, I'm not coming to get you, he said. I'm asking so I know how far you'd need to move if something changed. A pause. She told him. A small town in the eastern part of the state, near the Pennsylvania border, 8 hours from Millhaven by his reckoning. The friend whose place you're at, he said. Can she be trusted not to tell anyone you're there? She's already not told anyone. She doesn't even know my real name. Has she told anyone about a guest? Posted anything? She's not... A pause. She's careful. She's a private person. She understands that I need to be quiet. People tell things without meaning to, he said, not maliciously. They mention a house guest to a neighbor. They say a friend is visiting to explain an extra car in the driveway. Silence. I'll talk to her, Natalie said. Do it tonight. I will. Another pause, different in quality from the previous ones. More loaded. How's Emma? He glanced toward the hallway, toward Emma's closed door where a strip of light was still visible under it. She was supposed to be asleep, but was probably reading with a flashlight, which was something she believed she was concealing effectively. She still has your drawing, he said, the duck she made. She keeps asking when she can give it to you. A silence that went on long enough that he wondered again if the call had dropped. Ethan, she said. Her voice had changed, quieter, lower, stripped of everything except what it was. If the hearing goes the way it should, and the warrant gets revisited, is there any version of this where... She stopped herself. He waited. "Never mind," she said. "That's not a conversation for right now." "No," he said, "but it's a conversation." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said, "it's a conversation." "After the hearing," he said. "After the hearing," she agreed. They stayed on the line for another moment without speaking, which was a different kind of communication than talking. And then she said goodnight, and he said the same, and she was gone. He sat in the dark kitchen for a while. The strip of light under Emma's door went out. She'd heard him coming down the hall, probably, and killed the flashlight. He smiled at the wall in the general direction of that. 9 days before the hearing, Greenwald called with a question about the timeline of Ethan's initial contact with Natalie and whether he could provide a written account for the subcommittee record. Not testimony, not yet, possibly not at all, just a written factual account that could be entered as supporting documentation. Ethan said yes. He wrote it that night after Emma was in bed, at the kitchen table, in the plainest language he could manage. He wrote it the way he'd been taught to write after-action reports. What happened, when, in sequence, without interpretation. He sent it to Greenwald's secure email at 11 p.m. and went to bed. The next morning, Emma asked him, over breakfast, if Victoria was ever coming back. He looked up from his coffee. "Why do you ask?" "Because I still have the duck," Emma said. "It's been a long time." "It has," he said. "Is she in trouble?" He looked at his daughter across the breakfast table, at the straightforward directness of her, the way she asked the thing she actually wanted to know rather than approaching it sideways. "Yes," he said, "but she's working on it." Emma nodded seriously. "Is she working on it alone?" "Not completely." "Good," Emma said, and ate her cereal. He drove her to school and came back to the shop and did the morning's work. Around noon, a call came in from a number he didn't recognize but whose area code was from Eastern Ohio. He answered it. Nothing on the other end for 2 seconds. Then a voice he didn't know. Female, middle-aged, slightly nervous. "Is this Ethan Knox?" "It is." I'm Sarah. I'm the friend." A pause. "She asked me to call you if something happened." His hand tightened on the phone. "What happened?" "There was a man," Sarah said. "This morning, he knocked on the door asking about a car on the street, said it was blocking something. It wasn't. When I came back inside, she was already packing. She said she had to leave immediately. She said to call you and to tell you..." A pause. The sound of paper. "She wrote it down. She said to tell you, the evidence is safe and so is everything you did. Tell Emma the duck mattered. I'm sorry it wasn't more." And then she was gone. He stood in the bay of his shop with his hand on the phone and the words settling into him one at a time. "Tell Emma the duck mattered." "Did you see which direction she went?" he said. "She took the car, went north on Garrison Road." "Okay," he said. "You did right calling me. If anyone comes to your door, federal agents, anyone, you tell them you had a house guest you knew as an old friend, and she left this morning and you don't know where. That's all you say." "Is she going to be okay?" He looked at the floor of the bay, the oil stain near the lift that he'd been meaning to clean for 6 months. "She's been trying to do something that matters," he said. "She's going to make sure it gets finished." He hung up and stood in the empty bay and felt the specific helplessness of a man who had done everything available to him and was now at the edge of what was in his reach. He called Greenwald. "The source is mobile," he said. "She's been identified by a private investigator running parallel to the federal warrant. She's in motion as of this morning." Greenwald was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Where?" "Eastern Ohio as of an hour ago. Heading north. Mr. Knox sits... If she's apprehended before the hearing, the subcommittee can still proceed. The evidence is already entered. Her arrest does not invalidate the files." "I know," Ethan said, "but you told me a prosecutor would need to make a choice. Can you make that choice easier?" A pause. "I can call the U.S. Attorney's Office today," Greenwald said, "not to interfere with the warrant, but to formally notify them that the subcommittee's lead investigator is prepared to submit testimony to the effect that the evidence provided by the named individual is the primary basis for the hearing and that prosecution of the source would be viewed as..." Material interference in a congressional investigation. Will that hold? It will make the U.S. Attorney think very carefully about timing, Greenwald said, which is what we need. Do it today, Ethan said. Already picking up the other phone, Greenwald said, and the line clicked. Ethan put his phone in his pocket and looked around the shop. The tools on the wall, the vehicles in various stages of repair, the ordinary substance of a life built around making broken things work again. He thought about 8 years of missions, about the particular calculus of risk that special operations taught you, not the absence of fear, but the ability to move through it toward the thing that needed doing. About how that calculus never fully left a person, even when the uniform did, even when the life built around it deliberately moved toward the quiet and the ordinary. He had done what he could do. He had gotten the files to the right person. He had made the calls. He had put the evidence in the hands of people whose institutional weight could do what his couldn't. The rest was in her hands now, and had been all along, because it had always been her mission. He'd just been the mechanic on Birch Street who happened to be driving Route 7 on a rainy October night. He picked up a wrench and went back to work, because that was what you did when the operation was in motion and there was nothing left but to wait, and because the Ram's transmission still needed finishing, and because Kyle had been eyeing it with a hopefulness that suggested he was about to attempt something inadvisable. Outside, the November sky was low and gray, and the trees along Birch Street had gone bare, and the town of Millhaven moved through its Thursday with the steady indifference of a place that did not know it was at the edge of something, which was how most places existed at most moments, and which was, Ethan had come to understand, not indifference at all, but simply the ordinary world going on, the way it always went on, beneath whatever extraordinary thing was happening inside of it. He did not hear from Natalie Cross for 9 days. He knew better than to interpret silence as outcome. Silence was operational. Silence was a person in motion who couldn't afford the exposure of a phone call, who was making decisions in real time based on conditions he couldn't see from Millhaven, Kentucky. He understood all of that intellectually, and he held it in front of himself like a fact every morning when he woke up and checked his phone and found nothing. The hearing convened on a Wednesday. He knew the date. Greenwald had confirmed it in a brief email 3 days prior. Closed session, Senate subcommittee, the Bridgehart evidence formally on the record. No cameras, no press access, no public gallery. The kind of proceeding that happened in a room with bad lighting and too much recycled air, where the drama was entirely in the documents and the careful language of people who understood that what they said in those rooms had consequences that outlasted the day. He went to work. He did the brake job on a Dodge Caravan and the coolant flush on an old Jeep Wrangler whose owner brought it in every November like a seasonal ritual. Kyle asked him twice if he was okay, and he said yes both times, which was partially true. Emma had a school program that evening, something involving recorders, which was a musical instrument that existed specifically to test parental endurance. And he sat in the third row of folding chairs in the school gymnasium and listened to 20 second graders play a song he eventually identified as a version of Hot Cross Buns. And he clapped at the end with the full conviction of a parent who understood that the performance itself was not the point. Emma found him in this crowd afterward with the bright, exhausted face of a child who has done something publicly and survived it. "Was it good?" she said. "It was great," he said. "Tyler Mass dropped his recorder," she said, with the careful neutrality of someone who was not going to editorialize on this matter but wanted the fact documented. He drove her home. He made hot chocolate because it was cold and she asked. He sat at the table while she drank it and drew something in her notebook. She was always drawing something. And the kitchen was warm and the night outside was not. And he sat in that warmth and thought about a room in Washington where people were reading documents that a woman had risked everything to put in front of them, and waited. Greenwald called the following morning at 8:47 while Ethan was still in the driveway after dropping Emma at school. The session ran 6 hours, Greenwald said. They brought in a second panel in the afternoon. The suppression memos were entered into the formal record. The financial modeling document, the one showing the 30-day post-acquisition analysis, that generated the most sustained questioning I've seen in 8 years on this committee. Ethan sat in the parked truck in his own driveway and looked at the bare trees along the street. The subcommittee chair has formally requested a full DOJ investigation into Meridian Bio Group's acquisition and suppression practices, Greenwald said. That request carries significant weight. It's not an indictment, but it's the door opening. And the warrant on Natalie Cross? A pause that contained a different quality than the previous ones. Not hesitation, but the careful framing of something that had not fully resolved. The U.S. Attorney's Office contacted my office yesterday afternoon, Greenwald said. Off the record, their position has shifted. The formal term is that they are conducting a review of the evidentiary basis for the warrant in light of new information. He paused again. What that means practically is that active pursuit has been suspended pending that review. She's not being hunted right now. But the warrant still exists. For the moment, these things take time to formally vacate. A pause. Mr. Knox, I want to be straight with you. What happened in that room yesterday? What those files made possible? That doesn't happen without what you did. I want you to know that. The files were hers, Ethan said. The work was hers. I drove to Frankfurt and sent an email. You also wrote a statement, answered every question I put to you, and made a phone call to a stranger's office because a woman you'd known for 3 weeks trusted you with something irreplaceable. Greenwald let that sit for a moment. Don't minimize what that costs a person. Ethan looked at the trees. Is she okay? He said. I don't know where she is, Greenwald said. I'm hoping you'll know before I do. She called 4 days later. He was in the bay, alone. Kyle had left at 5, the shop was closed, and he was finishing a job he'd started in the afternoon because he worked better in the quiet of an empty building and had always been that way. He heard his phone from across the bay and walked to it and saw the Ohio area code and answered it on the second ring. Her voice was different, not managed different, not exhausted different, but different in the way a person is different when the thing they've been holding finally puts down a little of its weight. Still tired, still careful, but underneath it something that had more room in it than before. I heard about the session, she said. Greenwald called you? He left a message with Sarah. She reached me. A pause. The DOJ investigation is real. It was confirmed in a press release this morning from the subcommittee chair's office. Meridian's stock dropped 14% in the first hour of trading. I saw, he said. He'd checked his phone 3 times that morning, which he was not going to admit. Their lead attorney contacted Greenwald's office this afternoon, she said, requesting a meeting. Greenwald told them the subcommittee wasn't in the business of meetings with subjects of federal investigation referrals. A pause, and in this pause he could hear something that might have been the ghost of a laugh. I always liked Greenwald. Where are you? Still Ohio, she said. Still with Sarah. I didn't want to move again until I knew something solid. The warrant review, he said. Yes. Her voice was quiet. My attorney, a new one, someone Greenwald's office connected me with, says the formal vacating process is probably 60 days. Maybe less given the DOJ referral. But 60 days is 60 days. Are you safe for 60 days where you are? I think so. The private investigator stopped. Meridian has bigger problems than finding me right now. He nodded to himself. Good. A silence settled between them, comfortable in the particular way their silences had become. Not empty, but inhabited. 2 people on either end of a phone line sharing the same quiet. Ethan, she said, the Bridgeheart device. Greenwald said the expedited regulatory review has been formally requested as part of the subcommittee's findings. If the DOJ investigation proceeds the way he thinks it will, if Meridian is forced to release the original clinical data into the public regulatory record, the device goes forward, he said. It could be in hospitals in 18 months, she said. That's the timeline if everything moves the way it should. Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard in it before. Not quite peace, because too much was still unresolved for peace, but something in the neighborhood. Something that had found its footing. Sophie would be, he started. I know, she said before he could finish. I know. He leaned against the workbench. The bay was quiet around him, the vehicles dark in their stalls, the smell of oil and metal and old concrete that had become so familiar it was simply the smell of his days. Emma wants to give you the duck drawing, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Tell her I want her to keep it for now, Natalie said. Tell her I'm going to come get it in person. When When the warrant is vacated, she said. When I can drive into Millhaven without looking in the rearview mirror. A pause. Is that something that would be okay? He thought about the question she'd stopped herself from asking on their last call. The one that had gone unfinished but had been understood anyway, by both of them, because they were people who communicated as much in the spaces as in the words. Yeah, he said, that would be okay. But the 60 days became 43. On the 43rd day, a federal judge in the Eastern District of Kentucky signed an order vacating the warrant against Natalie Cross, citing the subcommittee's formal documentation of evidence origin and a DOJ preliminary finding that the removed files constituted the subject's own proprietary intellectual property wrongfully misappropriated during the Helix Medical Solutions acquisition. It was 3 paragraphs of legal language that amounted to the simplest possible verdict. She had not stolen anything. She had taken back what was hers. Ethan read about it on his phone at the shop, standing at the front counter with his coffee going cold beside him. He texted her the one-line message they'd agreed on as the signal. Clear. Her response came back in 40 seconds. Driving tomorrow. 8 hours. Is there coffee? He looked at the message for a moment. Then he typed, there's a gas station on Mill Street. Their coffee is bad. She sent back, perfect. She arrived at 11:20 in the morning on a Friday in January, in a different car. Not a rental this time. Her own. A gray Subaru with Indiana plates that had made the drive from wherever she'd most recently been. He saw it pull into the lot from the bay window and watched her get out. She looked like herself. That was the first thing. She looked like the person he'd been talking to on the phone for 2 months. Not the person in the professional headshot, not the managed CEO in the navy blazer. She was in jeans and a heavy sweater, and her hair was down, and she had a paper cup of gas station coffee in each hand, which meant she'd stopped on Mill Street before coming here. She pushed through the front door with her shoulder because her hands were full. He came out from the bay. She handed him the coffee. It's terrible, she said. I know, he said. They stood in the front area of Knox Auto, 14 Birch Street, in the particular awkwardness of 2 people who have talked through a crisis and come out the other side and are now in the ordinary moment that follows extraordinary ones, which is always stranger than it has any right to be. You look different, she said, than on the creek bank. You look different too, he said, than on the creek bank. I had a head wound on the creek bank. You look better without it, he said. I mentioned that before. She almost smiled, and then did. And it was the same smile he'd seen at the park. Not the professional one, but the other one. The one that had more of her actual face in it. Kyle emerged from the back and stopped dead when he saw her, with the specific frozen quality of someone who had walked into a room and instantly understood he was in the middle of something he didn't have context for. Kyle, Ethan said, take your lunch. It's 11:20, Kyle said. Early lunch, Ethan said. Kyle grabbed his jacket with commendable speed and was out the door in under 30 seconds. Ethan heard his car start. Natalie watched this with visible amusement. He does that fast, she said. He's adaptable, Ethan said. They stood for another moment with their bad coffees. Outside, a car passed on Birch Street. The shop's space heater clicked and hummed. I thought about this drive a lot, she said. What it would feel like to just get in a car and go somewhere without checking the mirror every 30 seconds. How does it feel? She thought about it honestly, which was something he'd come to expect from her. She didn't reach for the easy answer. Strange, she said, like wearing a coat you haven't worn in a long time and finding it still fits. She looked around the shop, the tools on the wall, the vehicles in the bays, the same ordinary space she'd sat in on a terrifying Saturday night wrapped in a blanket. I owe you a coat, actually, a Carhartt Detroit jacket, size large with electrical tape on the elbow. I replaced it, he said. I know, I owe you a coat anyway. He looked at her. They stood in the shop and drank the bad coffee and talked for 2 hours. And it was the easiest conversation they'd had because nothing was pressing against it from the outside for the first time since they'd known each other. They talked about the DOJ investigation, which was proceeding with what Greenwald called unusual velocity, and what that meant for the Bridgehart regulatory timeline. They talked about Meridian Bio Group's board, 3 of whom had retained personal criminal defense attorneys in the past month, which was the kind of information that arrived in news items and whose significance didn't require explanation. They talked about what Natalie was going to do next, which was a question she'd been sitting with. I can't go back to Vantage, she said. There's nothing to go back to. The company is going to be under investigation for 2 years minimum. The board will be replaced, probably the executive team. It's going to be gutted and rebuilt by people who weren't there for any of this. Is that what you'd want to go back to? He said. She considered it. No, she said. No, I don't think so. Then what? Greenwald's office has asked if I'd be willing to work as a technical consultant during the DOJ investigation, provide context on the Bridgeheart development, the acquisition process, the suppression timeline. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. After that, I don't know. There are people doing the work I want to do. Smaller organizations, outside the pharmaceutical structure, people who are trying to move devices like Bridgeheart through channels that aren't dependent on corporate approval. She paused. I've been thinking about Indiana, about going back. To stay? Maybe. She looked at him. What I know is that I've been somebody else for 4 years and I'm done with that. I want to be Natalie Cross. I want to work on something that has Sophie's name attached to it somewhere, even if nobody else knows it. She paused. I want to be able to drive without checking the mirror. He looked at her. That sounds like a plan, he said. It's the beginning of one, she said. Plans have more specificity. Emma's school let out at 3. He told Natalie, and she said she'd stay, if that was okay, and he said it was. They closed the shop at 2:30, and he drove to Millhaven Elementary, and Natalie waited in his truck because she said she didn't want Emma to see her for the first time in a parking lot, which was a thing he hadn't thought to consider, but which was, he recognized, the right instinct. Emma came out of school in her coat with her backpack bouncing and found him standing by the truck, and then found Natalie in the passenger seat through the window, and stopped walking entirely for about 2 seconds, which for Emma was a significant pause. Then she opened the door. You came, Emma said. I said I would, Natalie said. Emma looked at her with the thorough assessment she gave everything she hadn't fully sorted yet. Then she held out the rolled piece of paper she'd been carrying in her backpack for 2 months, because she'd told him in November that she was going to keep it ready. The duck, in purple crayon, slightly crumpled at one edge from the backpack. Natalie took it carefully with both hands and unrolled it and looked at it for a long moment. He's perfect, she said. He's a little crooked, Emma said. So is most of the best stuff, Natalie said. Emma looked at her dad. He looked out the windshield. Dad says that, Emma said. I know, Natalie said. I think he's right. Emma got in the back seat and buckled her seatbelt and decided, apparently, that this was a satisfactory state of affairs, because she started telling Natalie about the recorder concert, and Tyler Mass dropped instrument with the same detail and energy she'd applied to the original account. And Natalie listened with the same quality of attention that Emma had recognized the first day at the park. The real kind. The kind that didn't nod before you'd finished. Ethan drove them home. Mama's. Mutt. He testified before the Senate subcommittee in February. They offered him the option of written testimony only, and he considered it for a day before deciding to appear in person. Greenwald's assistant had sent him information about appropriate attire for a Senate hearing, which he'd read once and disregarded. He wore a clean shirt and his good jacket and drove to Washington in his truck because he didn't like airports, which was something he'd never examined too closely because it was probably not purely about airports. The hearing room was smaller than television made it look. Low ceilings, wood paneling that had been there for decades and looked it. A long-raised dais where the senators sat, most of them flanked by staffers who were doing the actual work of following the documents. The gallery was open to press for this session, a public follow-up to the closed initial hearing, and he could hear them behind him in a way he mostly blocked out. He sat at the witness table. Microphone. A glass of water he didn't touch. A name placard. Knox. Ethan D. The committee chair, a senator from Vermont who had the particular quality of weary competence that long tenure sometimes produced, read his name into the record and thanked him for appearing and asked him to describe, in his own words, the circumstances of his initial contact with the individual known as Natalie Cross. He spoke clearly and without performance. He described Route 7, the storm, the car going through the guardrail, the creek. He described what he'd done and why, which was not complicated. There was a person in the water, and he knew how to help, and he helped. He described the subsequent conversations, the information she'd shared, the decision to contact Greenwald's office. One senator, a man from Georgia, whose questioning style had the practiced combativeness of someone running for something, asked him whether he understood at the time he transmitted the files that he was potentially obstructing a federal investigation. Ethan looked at him steadily. "I understood that a federal warrant had been issued," he said. "I also understood that the warrant was based on a characterization of events that omitted the most important fact, that the research belonged to the person who took it. I made a judgment call. Those are the facts." "And you're comfortable with that judgment?" the senator said. "I'm a father," Ethan said. "The device that Natalie Cross spent 6 years developing, the one that's now in expedited regulatory review, that device is specifically for children with congenital heart conditions. Children who currently run out of options." He paused. "My daughter is 8 years old. She's healthy. But I've spent 2 years coaching a soccer team full of kids who are the same age as the children this device is designed to help, and I am very comfortable with my judgment." The room was quiet. The senator from Georgia moved on to his next question. Afterward, in the hallway outside the hearing room, Greenwald shook his hand and said he'd done well, which Ethan received with a nod because the hearing itself was not the part that mattered. The part that mattered was in the regulatory filings and the DOJ proceedings and the clinical re-review of Bridgehart's trial data, all of which were grinding forward in the slow, institutional way of large things that had nonetheless been set in motion and would not be easily stopped. He drove home through 4 states and arrived back in Millhaven at 10 at night and sat in his truck in the driveway for a minute before going in. The house was dark except for the kitchen light that he always left on. Emma was at his neighbor's for the night. The town was quiet the way small towns are quiet in February. Not empty, but settled into itself, doing the ordinary work of being a place where people lived. He went inside and made coffee he didn't need and sat at the kitchen table where he'd made most of the decisions of the last 4 months, and he thought about what it meant to have done the thing he'd done. Not heroism. He had strong feelings about that word, and none of them were good. Heroism was a narrative device that other people applied after the fact to make events legible. What he had actually done was considerably less grand. He'd pulled a person out of water, made a few phone calls, driven to Frankfurt on a Thursday, sent an email, and told the truth to a Senate subcommittee. The extraordinary content of those actions existed not in him, but in what Natalie Cross had already done before any of it. 6 years of work, 4 months of running, a lifetime of carrying Sophie's absence in every professional choice she made. He had been the mechanic. He had fixed the thing that was broken enough to get it where it needed to go. That was not nothing, and it was also not more than what it was. He thought about something his commanding officer had said to him once, years ago, after a particularly difficult extraction. Not a debrief, not an official observation, just a man talking to another man outside a building in a country he couldn't name. The ones who do it for the story never last. The ones who do it because it's in front of them, they're the ones still standing at the end. It had been true then. It was still true. Look, the Bridgeheart pediatric stent delivery system received conditional FDA approval 14 months after the Senate hearing. Ethan read about it on his phone over breakfast. Emma was eating cereal across from him, and he read the article twice. A brief item, 3 paragraphs below the fold of the health section of a national news site, and set his phone down. "What?" Emma said. She had the radar of a child who had spent years monitoring parental expressions for information. "Something good," he said. "How good?" He looked at his daughter across the breakfast table. At the bowl she'd made him in art class, slightly crooked, still holding his keys. At the strawberry shampoo smell that had been the smell of his mornings for years. At the particular matter-of-fact courage of a person who was 8 years old and already asked the real question every time. "A lot of kids are going to get help," he said. "Kids who didn't have good options before." Emma absorbed this. "Because of Natalie?" "Mostly because of Natalie," he said, "and a lot of other people." "And a little because of you," Emma said, in the tone of someone correcting the record. "A little," he said. She nodded and went back to her cereal, satisfied, filed. He looked out the kitchen window at the February morning, cold, bright, the trees still bare but with the quality of light that suggested something was getting ready to change. He thought about Natalie in Indiana, where she'd been for 3 months now, working with a small nonprofit cardiac device advocacy organization she'd helped build from the network of people she'd known from her years in the field. She called on Sundays. Emma had claimed those calls as a non-negotiable feature of the week, something that had happened gradually, and that none of the three of them had formally arranged. There was a conversation still unfinished between Ethan and Natalie, the one from the phone call in November, the one she'd stopped herself from completing. They had been circling it with the particular patience of two people who had both learned that forcing the shape of a thing before it was ready tended to break it. It was there. It would arrive when it arrived. He was, for the first time in longer than he could specifically identify, not in a hurry. He thought about Caroline, not with the grief that used to flatten him when he thought about her, not that it was gone, because it wasn't, because it wouldn't be, because some absences didn't heal so much as become part of the architecture of a person, but with the specific, almost peaceful acknowledgement of someone who had learned that loss was not a wall but a door, and that walking through it didn't dishonor what was behind it. She would have liked Natalie. He knew that without being able to fully explain how he knew it, the way you knew certain things about the people you'd loved well, not what they would have said or done, but what they would have felt. She would have liked the directness and the stubbornness and the way Natalie listened to Emma with her full attention. She would have found the duck drawing very funny. He drove Emma to school. She was working on a project about inventors, and she had decided with full conviction that her inventor was going to be someone nobody else in the class had heard of. And she had a list of candidates and had opinions about all of them. And the drive to school was 17 minutes of the kind of company that he had never once taken for granted. Not since the first morning he'd driven her anywhere, because he had understood from the beginning that this was the work. Not the deployments, not the things he couldn't talk about, not the citations in the file. This. The morning drives and the cereal and the bad recorder concerts and the crooked bowl that held his keys. He dropped her at the curb and watched her go through the doors and drove back to the shop. Kyle was already there, which was unusual and mildly suspicious, but turned out to be because he'd forgotten his phone charger the day before and had come in early to retrieve it, which was a very Kyle reason for a thing. They opened the shop. The work came in the way it always did. A truck with a brake issue, a Civic whose owner had been ignoring the check engine light longer than was advisable, a question from a walk-in about tires that Ethan answered and sent the man to a tire place down the road because he didn't do tires and believed in referrals. Around noon, Natalie texted, "Just saw the FDA news. 14 months. He looked at the text. 14 months, he typed back. She sent, "Sophie would have been 31 this year." He held the phone for a moment. "I know," he typed. "She'd have been proud." A pause, then she'd have asked why it took so long. He almost smiled. "Yeah," he typed. "She sounds like Emma." The response took a moment, then, "That's the best thing you've ever said to me." He put the phone in his pocket and went back to work. There is a particular kind of person who moves through the world without needing the world to notice them. Not because they lack conviction or depth, but because they understand somewhere down in the bones of them that the work is the thing, not the recognition of the work, not the story told about it afterward, not the name attached to it. Just the doing. Just the getting up and doing the next necessary thing because it is necessary, because someone has to, because you can. Ethan Knox was that kind of person. He had been a soldier, and then he'd stopped being a soldier, and then he'd been a father, which was its own kind of service with its own kind of demands. And somewhere in between, he'd been handed something that required more than a father and a mechanic could offer, and he'd found a way to offer it anyway, imperfectly, without a plan, making decisions that could have gone badly and happened not to. That is not a heroic story. Or if it is heroic in the small and unglamorous way that most real courage works. Not the cinematic version, not the version with the swelling music, but the version where a tired man in a flannel shirt drives 45 minutes in the rain to a pharmacy for children's ibuprofen and ends up in the water pulling a stranger out of a sinking car because it is in front of him, and he knows how. The children who would receive Bridgeheart devices over the coming years would not know his name. They would not know Natalie's name, not most of them. They would know only that there was a treatment now, that the doctors had something new, that the thing their parents had been told wasn't possible had become possible. They would grow up and have opinions about things and argue with their parents about music and lose things they loved and find things they didn't expect and live the complicated, non-idealized, specifically human lives that waited for them on the other side of survival. That was the whole point. That had always been the whole point. Natalie Cross never stopped working. She stayed in Indiana and built the advocacy organization into something with real institutional weight, a nonprofit that moves specifically in the space between research and regulatory approval with a focus on pediatric cardiac and pulmonary devices. She named it the Sophie Cross Foundation, which was not public knowledge for the first year and became public knowledge only when a journalist asked her directly at a conference, and she decided she was done keeping it private. She testified twice more before Senate subcommittees in the 3 years that followed, and both times she was introduced as the researcher whose work had led to Bridgehart's approval, and both times she corrected the record to say the work had been a team's, and that the team deserved the credit, and that she was there only to make sure it kept moving forward. Meridian Bio Group settled with the DOJ for $420 million and agreed to a 10-year compliance monitoring arrangement. 3 board members and the company's former CEO were individually charged with securities fraud and financial misrepresentation. The case moved through federal courts with the grinding slowness of large financial litigation and eventually produced 2 convictions and 1 plea arrangement and 1 verdict that disappointed everyone who had followed the case, which was how federal litigation tended to go, not with the clean resolution of a story, but with the messy, partial, imperfect accountability that was nonetheless accountability. Drummond sent Ethan a 1-line email the day the first conviction came down. It said, "Thought you'd want to know." He signed it with just his last name. Ethan wrote back, "Thanks." That was the entirety of their correspondence from that point forward, which felt right to both of them, he suspected. Emma grew up, not quickly. She grew up the way children grow up, in the gradual, daily accumulation of small changes that are invisible from moment to moment and obvious in retrospect. She grew up in the truck on the morning drives to school. She grew up on the soccer field and in the school gymnasium and at the kitchen table with her crayons and her notebook. She grew up asking the real question every time and getting better answers as she got better at asking. At 12, she decided she was interested in medicine. At 14, she revised this to specifically biomedical engineering, which Ethan received with the specific pride of a parent watching a child find the shape of themselves. He did not push. He did not steer. He answered her questions when she had them and stayed out of her way when she was working and made dinner 4 nights out of 7 and accepted frozen pizza on the remaining 3 without complaint, as he always had. She knew the full shape of the story by the time she was 10, not all at once, not in a formal telling, but in the way families accumulate knowledge of their own history, piece by piece, until the picture is complete. She knew about the creek and the files and Frankfurt and Washington. She knew about the duck she'd drawn in purple crayon that Natalie kept on her desk in Indianapolis, in a frame, slightly crooked. At 10, she asked him, "Were you scared?" He thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said. "Of what?" "Of making the wrong call," he said. "Of it going badly and you paying for it." She thought about that. "But you did it anyway." "Yeah." "Why?" He looked at his daughter, at the person she was becoming, this specific and particular person with her own specific and particular way of moving through the world, asking the real question, filing the honest answer, carrying things without dropping them. "Because some things are bigger than being scared," he said, "and because you can't teach someone something you're not willing to do yourself." She looked at him for a long moment with the thorough assessment she'd always given to things she was sorting. "Okay," she said, and went back to her homework. He sat at the kitchen table in the house on the edge of Millhaven, Kentucky, with the November dark outside the window and the space heater clicking and the crooked bowl his daughter had made holding his keys on the counter, and he thought that there was no version of his life, not the deployments, not the years of service, not anything that had come before the night he drove Route 7 in the rain, that had asked more of him than the ordinary ones. The missions he was most proud of had no citations. They had no records. They were the morning drives and the right answers and the decision to stay when staying was hard, and the understanding that some of the most important things a person could do looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. He made coffee. He waited for Sunday.